Florence sleeps beneath a velvet sky, its narrow streets curled like veins around the heart of a restless city. Torches flicker along the Arno, their light trembling on black water. Bells toll softly from distant towers, calling the faithful to prayer. Yet inside the sacred walls of Santa Maria del Fiore, a darker ritual unfolds. The priest, robed in gold, raises the chalice. His lips tremble. The crowd kneels. Then, as the wine touches his tongue, his face contorts. The chalice slips from his hands, shattering on marble. A gasp spreads through the cathedral like wind over fire. Moments later, the man of God lies lifeless at the altar. Poison, they whisper. But whose? No one dares to answer. The camera moves through the church, past frescoes that seem to watch in silence. Angels painted by hands that served both faith and ambition. Above them, the dome looms, immense and eternal. It was the pride of Florence, the symbol of its divine favor. But tonight, it feels heavy, oppressive, as though the heavens themselves are holding their breath. Outside, thunder rolls over the Tuscan hills. The narrator's voice cuts through the storm. In Florence, beauty was never innocent. This is a city where art and power are lovers, where saints and sinners kneel side by side. And at the center of it all, a name spoken with awe and fear alike: Medici. To some, they are the saviors of the Renaissance. Patrons of genius, builders of domes, protectors of learning. To others, they are merchants of corruption, the gilded puppeteers of God and gold. Their crest, 6 red spheres on a field of gold, marks not just palaces and chapels, but graves. As dawn rises over the terracotta rooftops, Florence awakens to the sound of hammers and voices, of merchants haggling and monks chanting. The city is alive, but beneath its rhythm beats another pulse, one of debt, favor, and whispered secrets. Every artist owes his patron, every priest owes his banker, and every soul, it seems, owes something to the Medici. They are not kings, not yet, but their reach is longer than any sword. Even the Pope must count their coins before he prays. The story of their rise is not a tale of conquest but of calculation. It begins not on the battlefield, but in the counting house, a place where parchment and ink decide the fate of nations. The Medicis understand something their rivals do not: that in a world ruled by faith, the true power lies not in the blessing, but in the debt behind it. For every indulgence sold, for every cathedral built, a Medici ledger grows heavier. Yet what makes this family's story so haunting is not their wealth alone. It is their paradox. They funded miracles while committing sins. They paid for paintings that preached humility, even as they purchased men's loyalty. They built hospitals and financed wars. They prayed, they plotted, they poisoned, and they prayed again. They were both the architects and the undoing of their own paradise. The streets of Florence remember them still. The Palazzo Vecchio, where their portraits hang like sentinels. The Uffizi, where their treasures whisper of beauty's price. Even the air feels touched by their presence, heavy with the ghosts of artists they made immortal, and the enemies they erased. History records their triumphs. Rumor guards their crimes. Between the two lies the truth, buried beneath centuries of marble and myth. In the flickering candlelight of a Florentine chapel, a chronicler dips his quill into ink. He writes not to praise, but to understand. Power, he notes, is a disease disguised as destiny. For the Medicis, that disease became hereditary. It flowed through generations, from humble bankers to popes and dukes, infecting art, politics, and faith alike. Their legacy built the Renaissance, yes, but it also fractured the soul of Europe. To tell their story is to walk a line between admiration and dread. You cannot speak of the beauty of Michelangelo without touching the blood that paid for his stone. You cannot praise the genius of Botticelli without seeing the fear that made him burn his own work. Florence was a dream city, yes, but it dreamed on a foundation of silence, enforced by gold. And so we return to that poison chalice. It is more than a crime. It is a symbol, a warning. In Florence, every act of devotion hid a negotiation. Every masterpiece was a transaction. And the Medicis understood, better than anyone, that men will forgive almost anything, except poverty. Theirs was a faith not in God, but in the illusion of order they created. To them, sin was not the breaking of a commandment, but the failure to pay what one owed. As the camera rises above the city once more, dawn light washes over domes and courtyards, revealing the splendor that still captivates the world. We see Florence not as a museum, but as a living contradiction. Holiness intertwined with greed, art with ambition, faith with manipulation. The narrator's voice returns, calm yet heavy. They gave us the Renaissance, and they taught us how to sell it. From this single family, empires would rise and fall. Popes would bless wars, painters would immortalize sin, and Florence, the city of light, would become a stage for darkness to dance in beauty's disguise. The death of a priest was only the beginning. Behind every altar, behind every portrait and fresco, lies a shadow in the shape of a coin. What follows is not simply the history of a dynasty. It is the anatomy of power itself, how it seduces, corrupts, and survives. The Medici story is not confined to their time. It echoes through ours, where fortune still buys truth, and beauty still hides ambition. As the last bell of morning rings, the question lingers in the air like incense. What price are we still paying for the glory they built? The camera fades to black. The echo of the tolling bells fades with it. Only the whisper of the river remains, carrying the secrets of Florence beneath its shimmering surface. The dark history of the Medici has begun. The story begins not with a crown, but with a coin, small, ordinary, easily overlooked. In early 15th century Florence, money moves like blood through the city's veins, and at its heart stands a man few would recognize as a future patriarch of power. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici sits at his wooden desk in a dimly lit counting house, the smell of ink and wax thick in the air. Outside, the clatter of horses and merchants echoes through the narrow streets, but inside, only the soft scratch of his quill disturbs the silence. He is not a nobleman nor a soldier, yet he will shape history more profoundly than any warrior of his age. Giovanni learned early that Florence was a city built on contradictions. It preached piety yet worshipped wealth. It adored art yet feared change. To survive here, one had to master both faces of the city, humility and ambition. Giovanni wore humility like armor. His clothes were plain, his words measured. To those who dealt with him, he was an honest banker, reliable and fair. But behind his calm exterior was a mind that saw what others could not. That money was not merely a tool, but a weapon. In a city where votes were bought as easily as bread, where even the church owed debts, the banker who held the purse strings would hold the world. The Medici Bank began modestly, one of dozens scattered across Florence. Yet Giovanni possessed something rarer than gold: trust. In an age of suspicion, when fraud and bankruptcy ruined many, he built a reputation for integrity. When other bankers demanded collateral, Giovanni offered courtesy. When others flaunted their fortune, he concealed his. In time, merchants from Venice, Milan, and even distant Bruges turned to him for security. The Medici ledgers thickened, and with each new entry, the family's influence spread invisibly, quietly, like roots beneath stone. But Florence was not a city that forgave success. The Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, old families with deep pride, watched this humble banker with wary eyes. They measured power in bloodlines, not balance sheets, and the rise of a merchant unsettled them. Yet Giovanni knew that envy could be turned into dependence. He lent money to his rivals, funded their ventures, and when fortune turned against them, as it often did, their debts became his invisible chains. No swords were drawn, no armies marched, only contracts signed in candlelight, binding the mighty to the modest. Then came his boldest move. In Rome, the papacy groaned under the weight of corruption and conflict. Popes came and went, leaving debts larger than their legacies. Where others saw chaos, Giovanni saw opportunity. Through careful negotiation and subtle persuasion, he secured the most coveted partnership in Europe. The Medici Bank would become the financial arm of the Holy See. Every indulgence sold, every tithe collected, every payment made to God himself would pass through Medici hands. Florence might still kneel before the altar, but the keys to heaven's treasury now jingled in Giovanni's purse. The arrangement transformed the family overnight. Gold flowed from every corner of Christendom. But Giovanni remained cautious. He reinvested in Florence, sponsoring craftsmen, restoring churches, and quietly aiding the poor. To the city, he appeared as a benefactor, a man guided by divine generosity. Yet each charitable act was also a calculation, a way to bind loyalty where fear alone could not. He understood that the greatest power in Florence was not fear but gratitude, gratitude that could be recalled like a debt. As his fortune grew, Giovanni began shaping a legacy that reached beyond wealth. He taught his sons, especially young Cosimo, the silent language of influence. Never flaunt, always owe, never threaten, always remind. Money could build a palace, but subtlety could build a dynasty. Each handshake, each loan, each whispered favor was a brick in an unseen fortress. Power, he told Cosimo, is like credit. It exists only as long as others believe in it. Meanwhile, Florence shimmered with contradictions. Painters and poets roamed its streets, seeking patrons. Cathedrals rose higher each year, while beggars multiplied in their shadows. The church preached poverty, but its walls glittered with gold leaf bought by Medici coin. Giovanni observed it all with a quiet satisfaction. He was not merely funding faith, he was redefining it. Salvation now came with an interest rate. Every sinner who purchased forgiveness unknowingly strengthened the Medici grip on both soul and city. Yet Giovanni was not cruel. To many, he seemed almost saintly in his restraint. He refused excessive luxury, avoided public feasts, and lived simply. But this simplicity was deliberate, a disguise that hid the architecture of control. His modesty disarmed enemies, while his generosity created allies. Florence called him the good man, and for a time he truly believed he was. Perhaps he was. For in his own way, Giovanni saw his work as divine. To bring order to a chaotic world, to turn greed into grace. As the years passed, his fortune became the city's lifeblood. Guilds prospered under his loans. Artists found patrons through his introductions. When famine struck, he opened his granaries. When plague returned, he funded hospitals. Every act of mercy strengthened the illusion that the Medici were Florence's guardians, not its rulers. Few noticed how completely the city now depended on them. Even the most powerful families found themselves entangled in Medici credit. Florence was still a republic on paper, but its freedom had been mortgaged, one florin at a time. In the twilight of his life, Giovanni walked through the streets he had transformed. He saw his bank's symbol carved into stone facades, his coins circulating in markets he once could not afford to enter. Yet he also sensed the cost. Power, even silent power, drew resentment. The whispers began again. Too rich, too ambitious, too dangerous. The old families plotted, waiting for his death to strike at his heirs. Giovanni said nothing. He had prepared Cosimo well. They may hate you, he warned his son, but they will need you more. On the day of his funeral, the city mourned with genuine tears. Bells rang from every tower. Priests spoke of charity and virtue, of a man who served both God and Florence. Yet somewhere in those sermons lay an unspoken truth, that the humble banker had reshaped the destiny of nations without ever wearing a crown. His death marked not an ending, but the quiet passing of an era from modest beginnings to monumental ambition. The Medici Bank would outlive its founder. Under Cosimo, it would become a force so vast it could make or break kingdoms. But it was Giovanni who forged the template. Patience, prudence, and power that smiled while it suffocated. In the dim light of his old counting room, ledgers remain, ink faded but legible, each line a record of faith turned to finance. The coins he once counted now rest in museums, relics of a pious deception. Florence continued to prosper, unaware it had already been conquered. Its conqueror had no army, no throne, and no sword. Only a pen, a prayer, and the quiet certainty that in a city of saints and sinners, the banker would always be closest to God. The bells of Florence toll softly across the rooftops as a young man stands at the window of his father's home, watching the morning light strike the red tiles. Cosimo di Giovanni de' Medici is not yet the figure history will come to call the elder, but his eyes already carry the stillness of someone who sees farther than most. The city stretches before him, a mosaic of trade, prayer, and intrigue. Beneath its beauty lies the quiet hum of danger. In Florence, the air itself seems charged with rivalry. The Albizzi control the government, the Strozzi control trade, the church controls salvation, and yet, Cosimo senses something shifting. The future, he knows, will belong to those who understand that power is not merely held. It is built patiently, invisibly, layer by layer. When Giovanni's death leaves the bank in Cosimo's hands, Florence expects a cautious heir. Instead, it finds a strategist of rare genius. Cosimo inherits not only wealth but an empire of obligation. Debts owed by nobles, cardinals, even kings. His father's quiet strength transforms in him into something sharper, colder. The son sees what the father only hinted at. That influence can be made permanent if disguised as generosity. He begins to weave a web across the city. One spun not with silk, but with trust, and once caught, few escape it. Cosimo walks the streets of Florence like a man surveying his creation. He visits guilds and artisans, not as a lord but as a friend. He commissions altarpieces and hospitals, funds monasteries and markets. Every donation bears the Medici name, and every recipient becomes a thread in his expanding tapestry of loyalty. To the people, he appears benevolent. To the powerful, indispensable. He lends without boasting, gives without question, and forgives debts with theatrical grace. Gestures that make him seem almost saintly. Yet every act is a move on a chessboard. Every gesture carries a quiet demand. Remember who fed you when others turned away. At the center of this new Florence stands the Medici Bank, now the most trusted in Europe. Its branches stretch from London to Geneva, from Rome to Bruges. Through its accounts flow the fortunes of popes, princes, and merchants alike. But while others count their profits in gold, Cosimo counts his in favors. He knows that wealth alone cannot save him from envy, but obligation might. In a city built on vanity, he hides behind modesty. Dressing simply, speaking softly, smiling often. He sits in the Republic's councils, listens more than he speaks, and allows others to believe they govern. Yet beneath their debates, his hand steers policy, unseen but undeniable. Still, Florence is a restless city, and even subtle power invites suspicion. The old families whisper that the Medicis have grown too influential. The Albizzi, long the rulers of the Florentine Republic, see their own dominance fading. To them, Cosimo's humility looks like deceit, his charity like conquest. They begin to move against him, spreading rumors, accusing him of corruption and secret tyranny. The air in the palaces grows tense. Alliances fracture. Cosimo smiles through it all, knowing that politics in Florence is less a storm to be avoided than a tide to be navigated. But tides can turn suddenly. In 1433, the Albizzi make their move. Armed guards appear at the Medici Palazzo. Cosimo is arrested on charges of treason, accused of plotting to overthrow the Republic. The accusation is absurd, but in Florence, perception is more lethal than proof. He is dragged before the Signoria, the ruling council, and imprisoned in the grim tower of the Palazzo Vecchio. Outside, the people murmur in disbelief. The man who built their hospitals, who paid their taxes when famine struck, now sits in chains like a criminal. Days pass in darkness. In his cell, Cosimo contemplates his father's lessons. He realizes that his true power, money, can save him even here. Gold moves where armies cannot. Through intermediaries, he bribes guards, buys friends, softens verdicts. The Albizzi plan to execute him, but Florence itself resists. Merchants threaten strikes, artisans refuse commissions, and the city trembles at the thought of losing its greatest benefactor. The very system that sought to destroy him depends too heavily on his wealth to see it through. Within weeks, Cosimo's death sentence transforms into exile. It is the Albizzi's first mistake. Banished from Florence, Cosimo travels north to Venice, that other great city of merchants. There, amid canals and marble palaces, He studies how a republic can thrive without kings yet remain enslaved to commerce. Venice welcomes him as an honored guest and quietly observes his restraint. He does not curse Florence or plot vengeance. Instead, he waits. Patience, he knows, is a weapon sharper than any blade. Meanwhile, his agents continue working. They lend to Florentine families, support allies in secret, and quietly let the Albizzi ruin themselves through mismanagement. Within a year, the city that expelled him finds itself strangled by debt and unrest. The people clamor for stability, and there is only one man who can restore it. In 1434, Cosimo returns. Florence greets him not as an exile but as a savior. Bells ring, crowds cheer, and the Albizzi flee in disgrace. No armies march, no blood is spilled, and yet, the Republic is effectively his. He takes no official title, declares no monarchy, but every decree, every decision now bends toward the Medici will. He rebuilds the government not through fear but gratitude, ensuring that those who once opposed him owe their fortunes to his mercy. It is a masterstroke of silent conquest. With power secure, Cosimo turns his gaze toward eternity. He commissions grand works that will transform Florence into a beacon of the Renaissance. Architects like Brunelleschi and Michelozzo receive patronage to construct buildings that touch the sky. Scholars and philosophers find sanctuary in his libraries, where ancient Greek texts long thought lost are copied and studied anew. To the world, Florence becomes a temple of art and intellect. To Cosimo, it becomes the reflection of his mastery. Every dome, every fresco, every marble column whispers his name without uttering it. And yet, for all his glory, he remains haunted by the precariousness of power. He walks often through the cloisters of San Lorenzo, a church his family has adopted as its own. There, amid silence and incense, he contemplates mortality. He funds chapels, hospitals, and monasteries, not only out of faith but calculation. If sin can be measured, perhaps it can be balanced. If heaven can be bought, perhaps he can afford it. Florence worships him, though few understand him. Some see a saint, others a tyrant. But Cosimo does not seek love or fear, only endurance. He tells his advisors, "It is better to act than to appear." His power lies in the invisible, in debts remembered, promises honored, and gratitude that cannot be refused. When he dies in 1464, the Republic mourns as though it has lost a father. Yet the city he leaves behind is no republic at all. It is a masterpiece painted by invisible hands, a vision of harmony concealing perfect control. In the streets, his statues will one day stand as symbols of benevolence. But beneath their marble calm lies the truth, that Florence's golden age was built not by kings or soldiers, but by a banker who learned to rule without ruling, who turned generosity into domination, and who, in mastering the art of quiet power, became the first true prince of the Renaissance. The year is 1433. The sun sets over Florence, and the Arno reflects a dull, blood-orange glow. Inside the Palazzo Vecchio, torches hiss and crackle as the city's most powerful men gather in secret. Their faces are carved with suspicion and envy. Cosimo de' Medici, the quiet banker who has become the invisible ruler of Florence, sits imprisoned in the same building. Above him, in a council chamber thick with murmurs, the Albizzi and their allies decide his fate. The walls echo with words like treason, ambition, tyrant. But beneath those accusations lies something more dangerous than law: fear. Fear that one man's influence has outgrown the Republic itself. In the dark of his cell, Cosimo hears footsteps. A guard enters, carrying a loaf of bread and a cup of water. The guard lingers, uneasy, knowing this man could change his fortune with a single coin. "They will decide soon," he mutters. Cosimo simply nods. He does not plead or curse. He understands that Florence, like all cities, runs on the debts of men, and many of those debts still belong to him. Somewhere above, his enemies are dining on food bought with Medici gold, discussing his destruction over wine he once imported. Days stretch into weeks. Rumors spread across Florence like wildfire. The city's merchants grow restless. Without the Medici, the flow of credit falters, Trade slows, panic grows. Artisans cannot be paid. Soldiers grow impatient. Even the church hesitates to act, for its own treasuries are bound to Medici accounts. Cosimo's enemies begin to realize that killing him would not bring stability. It would bring ruin. Still, pride blinds them. They vote to exile him, believing Florence can survive without its banker. When the verdict is read, Cosimo bows his head slightly. There is no rage, no despair, only calculation. He knows exile is not death. It is a pause. The guards escort him through the streets, their armor glinting in the afternoon light. Crowds gather to watch the fall of Florence's richest man. Some shout curses. Others weep quietly. A few bow as he passes. "He gave us bread," one woman whispers. Cosimo says nothing, only glances once toward the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, the unfinished cathedral whose construction he had saved with his own money. The message is clear. The city may drive him out, but it cannot build without him. He leaves for Venice, traveling under escort along dusty roads lined with vineyards and monasteries. Yet even in exile, Cosimo is not powerless. In Venice, he is received not as a criminal but as a guest of honor. The Doge himself welcomes him, aware that the Medici fortune could revive or ruin entire economies. Venice is a city of merchants. It respects gold more than lineage. Cosimo studies its canals, its quiet efficiency, and its careful balance of wealth and governance. He understands now that Florence must be guided in the same way, not ruled openly, but steered invisibly, through commerce, through culture, through quiet control. Back in Florence, the Albizzi celebrate their triumph. They host banquets, claiming they have restored the Republic. But celebration soon turns to unease. The Medici Bank, now leaderless, withdraws its loans. Trade halts. Tax revenues collapse. The wool guilds, the lifeblood of the city, struggle to pay their workers. And the people, who once praised the Albizzi as defenders of freedom, now whisper their discontent. Markets grow silent. Taverns murmur with talk of famine. Florence, it seems, cannot breathe without the Medici. Meanwhile, in Venice, Cosimo works quietly. His agents continue to operate across Europe. They lend money to Florence's allies, finance the papacy, and fund mercenaries who might one day serve his cause. He does not send armies, only letters. Each one is a thread pulling the city closer to collapse. He waits patiently as the Albizzi government begins to choke on its own arrogance. When their rivals in Milan threaten war, when the Pope withdraws his support, when trade routes dry up, Florence grows desperate. After only a year of exile, the tide turns. The Albizzi, once untouchable, are accused of tyranny. The very laws they used to expel Cosimo are turned against them. The city, broken and fearful, calls for his return. It is not a revolution of swords but of necessity. The man they cast out as a danger is now the only one who can save them. When Cosimo returns in 1434, the people flood the streets. Bells ring from every church tower. Banners flutter from windows. He enters the city not as a conqueror but as a redeemer. The Albizzi flee, their estates confiscated, their names erased from official memory. Florence is reborn, but under a new, silent ruler. Cosimo does not claim the title of duke or prince. He resumes his seat in the council, humble as before, smiling that same unshakable smile. Yet everyone knows who truly governs now. He wastes no time rebuilding the foundations of power. He restores the bank, reopens the markets, and forgives the debts of those who supported his return. His generosity binds Florence tighter than any law could. To the people, he is father of the nation. To his enemies, he is untouchable. And to himself, he is a man who has proven that exile cannot destroy what influence builds. Still, victory carries a shadow. Cosimo knows that Florence is fragile, its unity bought with gold and fear. He understands that to make his power eternal, he must make the city itself a reflection of his vision. He turns to art and architecture as instruments of authority. He commissions Brunelleschi to complete the dome, a feat no one else dared attempt. The cathedral becomes a symbol of divine perfection, and, subtly, of Medici greatness. Florence's skyline begins to change, shaped by the ambition of one man whose humility masks dominion. At night, he walks through the nearly finished cathedral. The air smells of stone and incense. He gazes up at the vast shell of the dome, whispering a prayer not for salvation, but for legacy. "Let them remember Florence," he murmurs, "and through it, remember us." In that moment, he understands that power is not measured in crowns or armies but in memory. The Albizzi may have ruled with fear, but he will rule with time, by building something too magnificent to be forgotten. Years later, those who once exiled him will tell their grandchildren of the day Cosimo returned. They will speak not of revenge, but of restoration, for he does not punish, he absorbs. His enemies' sons find work in his offices. Their daughters marry into his family's allies. The city forgets it ever defied him. Florence becomes an organism sustained by Medici blood, pulsing with wealth and art. Cosimo's exile fades into legend, a parable whispered to his descendants, that patience and calculation can achieve what violence cannot. From the shadows of that lesson will rise a dynasty that will shape the very meaning of power for centuries. The scent of marble dust and wet plaster filled the air of Florence, mingling with the faint, sweet aroma of olive oil and wine from the nearby markets. The city hummed like a great machine in motion. Bells tolled from every church tower, craftsmen shouted from their stalls, and apprentices scurried through the narrow alleys carrying sketches, pigments, and blocks of stone. This was not just a city. It was an organism breathing art, money, and ambition. And at its heart stood one man, Cosimo de' Medici. After his triumphant return from exile, he had transformed Florence into something the world had never seen before. A living masterpiece, engineered to secure both his power and his immortality. Cosimo understood that force was temporary, but beauty was eternal. While others built fortresses, he built churches. While tyrants commissioned armies, he commissioned artists. His genius lay in disguising domination as devotion. The people believed he served God and Florence, yet every column, every fresco, every chapel carried his quiet signature. It was power made invisible, woven into the very stones of the city. He began with the San Lorenzo Basilica, a project that had languished for years due to lack of funds. Cosimo approached Filippo Brunelleschi, the brilliant yet temperamental architect whose mind seemed to bend geometry itself. Together, they envisioned not just a church but a statement. Rational, symmetrical, divinely balanced. It would embody the spirit of Florence, and the Medici's role as its moral and artistic patron. To the devout, it was a temple of faith. To the wise, it was a monument to the family who paid for it. As the basilica rose, so did the Medici's reputation. Artists, thinkers, and scholars flocked to their side. Cosimo built not only structures but networks, invisible threads connecting bankers, poets, and priests. He financed libraries filled with Greek manuscripts rescued from the East, preserving knowledge that had been lost for centuries. Florence became the cradle of a new era, the Renaissance. But behind this golden dawn, shadows deepened. Many in Florence saw through Cosimo's humble facade. They called him the hidden tyrant, the man who ruled a republic through gifts and debts. Yet even his critics could not resist the prosperity he brought. The city grew rich beyond measure. The Medici Bank stretched across Europe, from London to Constantinople. Kings owed them money, popes owed them favors, and Florence, though nominally a free republic, moved according to Cosimo's will, like a marionette dancing to an unseen rhythm. Still, power came with its dangers. Cosimo knew that wealth and glory invited envy, so he cultivated an image of modesty. His own palace, designed by Michelozzo, was built not as an ostentatious fortress but as a residence of restrained dignity. Its rough-hewn exterior concealed luxury within: polished marble, gilded ceilings, secret chambers. Visitors entered expecting grandeur and left whispering about wisdom. Even in architecture, Cosimo mastered contradiction. He appeared simple yet reigned supreme. Inside his palace, the greatest minds of the age gathered around his table. There was Marsilio Ficino, the philosopher who would revive the lost wisdom of Plato. There were artists like Fra Angelico and Donatello, who found in Cosimo not just a patron, but a visionary. Their art spoke in symbols, halos that hinted at cosmic order, statues that breathed divine reason. Each masterpiece was a cipher, carrying within it the secret of Medici dominance. The idea that beauty itself could justify power. But beneath the glitter of art and intellect, Cosimo sensed danger brewing. The same wealth that elevated his family also drew the gaze of enemies, both foreign and domestic. The rival houses of Florence, though weakened, waited for a moment of weakness. The Vatican, whose coffers the Medici financed, began to view them as indispensable but dangerous. Even within his family, divisions stirred. Cosimo's sons were not cut from his cloth. Piero, his heir, was frail and often ill. The others lacked the patience and cunning that had carried their father through exile and triumph. As his health began to falter, Cosimo felt the weight of legacy pressing upon him. He had built a city of stone and intellect, but could he build successors who would understand its meaning? He began to withdraw from public life, spending long hours in his study surrounded by manuscripts and letters. In those quiet nights, he dictated his thoughts on virtue, faith, and fortune. He believed that the true art of power was knowing when to hide it. Florence, he often said, must never realize it had a master. One evening, as twilight bathed the Palazzo Medici in gold, he sat with his trusted advisor, the philosopher Niccolò Niccoli. "Do you think they will remember us?" Cosimo asked softly. Niccoli smiled faintly. "They will remember Florence, and in doing so they will remember you." Cosimo nodded, but his eyes betrayed unease. Memory, he knew, was fragile, and history was written by those who controlled it. He commissioned the completion of the Medici chapel within San Lorenzo, a private sanctuary, his final gift to the city. There, beneath arches of perfect proportion, he would rest beside his ancestors. The walls would bear no grand inscriptions, no boastful epitaphs, only the quiet magnificence of balance and form, the same values that had guided his rule. It was a temple of humility that concealed an empire of wealth. As the dome of Brunelleschi finally rose, completed against all odds, Florence gasped in awe. It was not merely an architectural triumph, it was a symbol of human potential. But to Cosimo, it was also prophecy. The dome represented both heaven and control, divine beauty achieved through human order. And in that symmetry lay the truth of his power. Florence was now the city of the Medici in everything but name. In his final years, Cosimo's hair turned silver, his movements slower, but his mind remained sharp. He often walked the cloisters of San Marco, which he had rebuilt for the Dominican friars. There he met Fra Angelico, painting frescoes of angels bathed in soft light. The old banker would pause, smile faintly, and whisper, "Let heaven shine here, on earth." Those who saw him in those moments mistook him for a saintly benefactor. Few understood that his faith was not only in God, but in legacy. When he died in 1464, the bells of Florence tolled as they had the day he returned from exile. Thousands filled the streets to mourn. The city council, knowing what he had been yet unwilling to deny his greatness, granted him a title never before given to a commoner, Pater Patri, Father of the Fatherland. Beneath the floor of San Lorenzo, he was laid to rest in a simple tomb, above which the words still echo through time, Cosimo, Father of his country. Yet even in death, Cosimo's story did not end. He had left behind something far more potent than wealth, a template, the art of ruling without ruling. The Medici heirs would inherit not only his fortune but his method, control through beauty, faith through art, and power through invisibility. Florence had been reborn in his image, and from that rebirth would come both the city's greatest glory and its darkest secrets. The funeral of Cosimo de' Medici marked the end of an age and the beginning of a new one. The bells of Florence rang out for 3 days, their echoes weaving through the narrow streets and echoing off the stone walls like a requiem for the city's father. But even as citizens mourned, the question hung heavy in the air. What now? The man who had built Florence's fortune, its art, and its myth was gone. And in his place stood his son, Piero de Medici, a man known not for his cunning or charisma, but for his fragile health. The people whispered a cruel nickname behind his back: Piero il Guttoso, Piero the Gouty. From his first day as head of the family, Piero was surrounded by wolves. The Medici Empire, vast and intricate, required constant vigilance. Its wealth was scattered across dozens of cities and hundreds of accounts. Its enemies were patient, waiting for the moment when the lion would falter. And Piero, confined often to his bed by pain and fever, seemed to them a sign of divine justice, a weak heir to a powerful legacy. Yet they underestimated the blood of Cosimo. Piero may have lacked his father's physical strength, but he possessed the same sharp intellect, honed by years of watching how power moved behind closed doors. His first act was to secure loyalty, not through threats or grand gestures, but through the oldest Medici weapon, money. He called in debts from those who had grown comfortable during Cosimo's last years. Many nobles, believing the new lord too weak to act, had allowed their obligations to lapse. Now Piero demanded payment. Those who could not pay were reminded who kept Florence afloat. Those who did pay found themselves once again bound to the family's network of influence. But beneath this pragmatic control, Florence trembled. The great banking houses, the Pazzi, the Strozzi, the Soderini, saw opportunity in Piero's weakness. They whispered alliances in shadowed gardens, plotted over wine in candlelit halls. The Republic's old guard dreamed of restoring the city to its pre-Medici purity. Some even sought support from rival powers: the Duke of Milan, the King of Naples, and the Pope himself. To them, Piero was an obstacle soon to be removed. The plot ripened in 1466. It began with subtle moves: whispers among merchants, bribes to soldiers, secret meetings in monasteries after dark. The conspirators believed they could spark a popular uprising, claim that the Medici had betrayed the ideals of the Republic. They planned to strike during one of Piero's many bouts of illness, when his guards were few and his household distracted. But the Medici, masters of silence and secrets, had eyes everywhere. One night, as rain lashed against the Palazzo Medici, a messenger arrived drenched and trembling. He carried a letter intercepted by Medici agents, a letter detailing the entire conspiracy. Piero, propped up by pillows, read it slowly. The names were familiar. Men who had eaten at his table, toasted his health, kissed his hand. He said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, he ordered his guards to close the city gates. The next morning, Florence awoke to the sound of boots in the streets. Soldiers loyal to Piero, men whose families the Medici had sustained for decades, surrounded the homes of the conspirators. By noon, the rebellion was broken. Some fled into exile. Others were dragged before the Signoria in chains. The message was unmistakable. The Medici might change faces, but not their power. Still, the victory came at a cost. Piero's health deteriorated rapidly after the crisis. The stress of betrayal, the weight of leadership, and the physical agony of his illness wore him down. Yet, in his final years, he prepared carefully for the next succession. His son, Lorenzo, was only 16, young, brilliant, and already beloved for his charm and wit. Florence had taken to calling him Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, even before he had proven himself. Piero saw in him a reflection of both Cosimo's mind and something more, a touch of the poet, the artist, the dreamer. In his last months, confined to his bed, Piero summoned Lorenzo to his side. The boy sat quietly, listening as his father spoke of alliances, of enemies, of how beauty could be both shield and weapon. "Remember?" Piero whispered, his voice strained with pain. "Our fortune lies not in gold, but in trust. Never let Florence see you as its master. Let them believe you are its servant." Lorenzo nodded, though he understood little of the burden he would soon bear. When Piero died in 1469, the transition was swift. There was no exile this time, no blood in the streets. The Medici name alone was enough to ensure loyalty. Lorenzo stepped into power with grace and confidence. Florence watched him with curiosity, perhaps even hope. The young Medici was handsome, eloquent, and gifted with an artist's heart. He wrote poetry, debated philosophy, and walked among the people without guards. To the citizens, he seemed a prince born of heaven. To the older families, he was a target wrapped in silk. In those first months, Lorenzo proved that he understood the balance his father and grandfather had built. He extended loans to struggling merchants, funded public festivals, and continued the patronage of artists and scholars. But behind the charm was calculation. He knew Florence had to be dazzled, distracted, and dependent. He turned politics into theater, a performance of generosity and intellect. The people adored him, and the nobles found themselves disarmed by his brilliance. Yet beneath the glitter of Renaissance splendor, the storm was gathering. The Pazzi family, humiliated by their failed coup and resentful of Medici dominance, began to conspire once more. This time not against Piero, but against his son. They would find allies far more dangerous than the old Republicans. Among them, the Archbishop of Pisa and even agents of the Pope. For Lorenzo's rise, while dazzling, would soon draw not only envy but wrath. As the shadow of the coming conspiracy crept closer, Florence glittered brighter than ever. Art and music filling every street, as if the city itself sought to drown out the whispers of treachery. In the palaces and workshops, men like Botticelli and Leonardo were finding their voices, funded by Medici gold. It was a golden age, but golden ages, as history knows too well, cast the darkest shadows. Piero's reign would be remembered not for its brilliance, but for its preservation. He had held the line when the Medici legacy wavered. His quiet cunning had ensured that Florence remained bound to his family. And though his body had failed him, his final act, securing the rise of Lorenzo, would mark the beginning of one of the most dazzling and dangerous chapters in Florentine history. The city, reborn under the Magnificent, was about to learn that beauty and blood often flowed from the same source. The morning light fell gently over Florence, spilling like molten gold across the rooftops and winding alleys. The city was awake. Merchants setting up their stalls, artists grinding pigments, apprentices rushing through the Piazza della Signoria. Yet all seemed touched by a strange kind of reverence. The new Medici lord, Lorenzo, had taken power. Barely 20 years old, he carried himself with an ease and confidence that felt almost divine. Where his father had been frail and reserved, Lorenzo was vibrant, magnetic, and unshakably sure of himself. He laughed easily, spoke eloquently, and made every person he met, from noble to beggar, feel seen. Florence had found not just a leader but a star. In those early years, Lorenzo's presence transformed the city. His love for art and poetry was not merely pastime. It was politics. He believed that beauty could unify a divided people, that culture could achieve what armies and decrees could not. Under his patronage, Florence became a living masterpiece, the beating heart of the Renaissance. He invited scholars, painters, and philosophers from every corner of Italy, filling his palazzo with voices that would echo through centuries. Among them were Botticelli, Verrocchio, and a young apprentice named Leonardo da Vinci. But while the world marveled at Florence's rebirth, Lorenzo understood what few did. Art was the mask of power. Every fresco, every sculpture, every poem served a purpose, to glorify Florence, and by extension, the Medici who embodied it. The cathedral's dome stood as a symbol of divine perfection, the Medici Palazzo, of earthly balance. Even public festivals were carefully designed performances, celebrations that reminded the people of who made their joy possible. Still, beyond the gilded facades, danger simmered. Florence was a city of envy as much as genius. The rival families, the Pazzi above all, watched Lorenzo's rise with clenched fists. For generations, the Pazzi had been among Florence's most respected bankers, their wealth rivaling the Medici. But under Lorenzo, their influence had withered. He had taken control of the papal accounts, cutting them from one of their richest sources of income. Pride turned to fury, and fury to hatred. At the same time, forces outside Florence began to stir. Pope Sixtus IV, a man of formidable ambition, resented the Medici's hold over the city's finances and its art. He dreamed of bringing Florence fully under papal control, transforming it into a jewel of his own domain. The Medici, with their independent wealth and alliances, stood in his way. It was only a matter of time before the Pope and the Pazzi found common cause, and that alliance would soon plunge Florence into chaos. But for now, the illusion of peace held. Lorenzo's court glittered with splendor. He wrote sonnets about love and divinity, recited Plato in the gardens of Correggi, and discussed the nature of virtue with Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. These were not idle gatherings. They were laboratories of ideology. The Medici crafted not only wealth and art but thought itself. They shaped how Florence and soon, all of Europe, would define beauty, reason, and human dignity. Lorenzo's leadership was as theatrical as it was strategic. He walked among the people without guards, stopping to listen to merchants or jest with apprentices. He funded dowries for poor girls, paid debts for struggling artisans, and financed public works that kept hundreds employed. To the people, he was Lorenzo the Magnificent, the living proof that a ruler could be both noble and kind. To his enemies, this very popularity was intolerable. His marriage to Clarice Orsini, a Roman noblewoman from one of Italy's most powerful families, further solidified his status, but also brought new tensions. Clarice was devout, traditional, and uncomfortable with the humanist world her husband inhabited. Their union was one of politics, not passion. While she prayed and governed the household, Lorenzo surrounded himself with poets, philosophers, and artists who viewed faith as a symbol, not a rule. Yet he never mocked her devotion. Instead, he wove her piety into his public image, presenting himself as both enlightened and virtuous, a bridge between heaven and humanity. Under Lorenzo, Florence's wealth flowed like a river. Trade boomed, the arts flourished, and the Medici Bank reached new heights. Yet cracks were forming beneath the marble surface. The costs of endless patronage, the lavish festivals, and the political bribes strained even the vast Medici fortune. Lorenzo's generosity was also his gamble. The more he gave, the more Florence adored him, but the more he owed. He was building not only a cultural empire but a financial illusion, one that could collapse with a single shift in fortune. Still, for a time, it seemed as if nothing could touch him. Visitors from across Europe wrote of Florence as a second Athens, a city of light, harmony, and human potential. When Lorenzo hosted a festival, the streets turned into theaters of wonder. Fireworks illuminated the night sky. Actors dressed as gods and muses danced in the piazzas. He commissioned plays, commissioned hymns, commissioned myths, and always, beneath the beauty, the message remained. The Medici are the soul of Florence. Yet in quiet corners of the city, dark conversations grew louder. The Pazzi and their allies in Rome began to weave their conspiracy. The Pope, humiliated by Lorenzo's refusal to grant him control over the Florentine fortress of Imola, had turned openly against him. To the church, Lorenzo was no longer a patron of beauty. He was a threat to divine order, a mortal man exalting himself too close to the heavens. The stage was set for betrayal. But Lorenzo, ever the poet, could not see the full danger. He believed too much in reason, too much in his own brilliance. He trusted that his charm and diplomacy could calm any storm. He continued to write verses, host philosophers, and fund painters even as the noose began to tighten around him. In his mind, Florence was eternal, and the Medici its destiny. In those days, walking through the cloisters of San Marco, Lorenzo often paused to admire the frescoes his grandfather had commissioned decades before. He saw in those painted angels the reflection of his family's dream, a dream of beauty as salvation. He never noticed how, in the shadows of the same frescoes, the faces of his enemies seemed to gather. The next chapter of his story would not be written in gold or marble, but in blood. The Pazzi, armed with papal approval and hatred sharpened by greed, would turn Florence's most sacred space, its cathedral, into a stage for murder. And when that day came, the city that had sung his praises would hold its breath, caught between divine judgment and the wrath of a dynasty that had long mastered the art of survival. For now, however, the bells of Florence rang for joy, and the people danced in the squares. The air smelled of promise and of fate, waiting quietly, just beyond the horizon. The spring of 1478 began with sunlight over Florence, the kind of golden morning that made the marble of the Duomo glow like a lantern. But beneath that beauty, tension twisted through the city like an invisible thread. The air itself seemed to vibrate with unease. Merchants whispered of strange alliances. Bankers spoke of debts being called in without warning. No one knew why, but everyone sensed that something was coming. And at the center of this gathering storm stood Lorenzo de' Medici, unaware that the deadliest betrayal in Florentine history was only days away. The Pazzi family had spent months preparing their plan. They were merchants, proud and ambitious, whose rivalry with the Medici went back generations. Lorenzo's control of the papal accounts had humiliated them. His political alliances had cut them off from power. Their leader, Francesco de' Pazzi, was fiery and reckless, the opposite of Lorenzo's calm intellect. He saw the Medici not as competitors, but as parasites devouring Florence from within. "We must tear them out by the root," he once told his co-conspirators. His hatred had a holy sponsor, Pope Sixtus IV. The Pope's grudge against Lorenzo was personal. The Medici had blocked his plans to acquire the fortress of Imola for his nephew, Count Girolamo Riario. Furious, the Pope transferred the papal banking contract from the Medici to the Pazzi, a financial blow meant to cripple Lorenzo's empire. But money was not enough. Sixtus wanted more. He wanted the Medici erased. And so, he lent his silent blessing to a plan that would shatter Florence itself. The conspiracy drew together an unlikely web of participants. Francesco de' Pazzi and his uncle Jacopo, the Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, Count Riario, the Pope's nephew, and a handful of soldiers and hired killers. Their aim was simple: to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano, the two Medici who stood between them and control of Florence. They chose their stage carefully. Not a battlefield or a dark alley, but the sacred heart of the city, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. On the morning of April 26, 1478, the bells of the Duomo rang for High Massachusetts inside. The great dome loomed like the vault of heaven. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, bathing the marble floor in hues of red and gold. Florence's most powerful families filled the pews. Among them, Lorenzo, dressed in fine green silk, and his younger brother Giuliano, handsome and kind, a favorite of the people. The conspirators had planned for both to attend, but Giuliano had been ill. Francesco de' Pazzi personally visited him that morning, pleading with him to come, assuring him that Florence would see his strength again. He smiled as he helped Giuliano dress, concealing beneath his robes a dagger. As the choir began to sing the Gloria, the congregation knelt. Lorenzo, standing near the altar, bowed his head. The voices rose in harmony, and then chaos. Francesco lunged forward, plunging his dagger into Giuliano's chest. The young Medici fell, gasping, struck again and again, 19 times. His blood splattered across the marble floor, staining the air with horror. In the same instant, another conspirator turned on Lorenzo. Steel flashed, shouts erupted, and panic spread through the cathedral. But Lorenzo moved with instinct. He raised his arm to block the blade, the knife slicing his neck and drawing blood, but not death. He broke free and pushed through the crowd, his attendants forming a human wall around him. They dragged him into the sacristy and slammed the heavy doors shut. Inside, Lorenzo pressed his hand to his wound, breath sharp, eyes blazing with disbelief and fury. Outside, the Duomo had become a slaughterhouse. Worshippers screamed, trampling one another in their flight. The assassins, realizing their failure, fled through the chaos. Giuliano's body lay lifeless near the altar, a vision of innocence destroyed. But the city that the Pazzi had hoped to liberate turned instantly against them. As news of the attack spread, Florence exploded in rage. Bells rang not for mass but for vengeance. Citizens armed themselves with swords, hammers, and torches, pouring into the streets. The conspirators who had not fled were seized on sight. Francesco de' Pazzi was dragged from his hiding place, beaten senseless, and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, the very seat of Florentine government. The Archbishop of Pisa met the same fate, his body swinging above the crowd as people screamed curses at him. The city became a vision of divine justice, brutal, chaotic, and absolute. Lorenzo, still bandaged, emerged days later to a city drenched in fear and fury. His brother was dead, but his enemies were annihilated. The Pazzi name was erased from public record. Their estates were confiscated, their coat of arms destroyed, their descendants exiled. Even the word Pazzi was forbidden to be spoken in the streets. Florence had seen blood before, but never such vengeance. Yet in the midst of grief, Lorenzo's power reached new heights. The assassination had transformed him from a ruler into a legend. The people saw him not merely as a patron or politician, but as a man chosen by fate, one who had survived the jaws of death itself. His leadership in the aftermath was swift and decisive. He comforted the families of the slain, rebuilt the church's trust, and sent emissaries across Italy to calm the storm that the Pope's complicity had stirred. But the Pope was not done. Outraged that his plot had failed and his allies had been executed, Sixtus IV excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict, cutting the city off from the sacraments. Then, he forged an alliance with King Ferdinand of Naples, preparing an invasion to crush the rebellious city. For the first time, Lorenzo's charm and intelligence would be tested not in art or philosophy, but in survival. Florence stood on the brink of ruin. Armies marched from the south. Trade collapsed. The people, once drunk on vengeance, now trembled at the thought of siege and starvation. But Lorenzo did something no one expected. He left Florence alone. Against all counsel, he sailed to Naples, into the heart of enemy territory, to negotiate directly with the king. It was a move as audacious as it was suicidal. For months, his fate hung in the balance. Yet his eloquence and courage turned the tide. He convinced Ferdinand that peace served them both, that war would only strengthen their common rivals. When Lorenzo returned home victorious, the city greeted him as a savior. His diplomacy had saved Florence not just from foreign armies, but from annihilation. From that moment on, no one doubted his mastery. He had faced daggers, popes, and kings and lived. Florence belonged to him as completely as art belonged to beauty. But though the city celebrated, a darker truth lingered beneath the frescoes and festivals. The Medici had crossed a threshold. The Pazzi Conspiracy had not destroyed them. It had baptized them in blood. From that day, their rule was no longer disguised as benevolence. It was destiny sanctified by survival. And as Lorenzo walked once more beneath the great dome, where his brother had fallen, he looked up at the heavens and murmured, "They tried to kill us in God's house." His voice was calm, almost reverent. "Then God has chosen to keep us." The years that followed the Pazzi Conspiracy transformed Lorenzo de' Medici into something more than a man. He became an idea, a myth made flesh. Florence, still haunted by the blood spilled beneath the dome, now looked to him as the embodiment of balance, the ruler who could wield absolute power with grace and guide the city through the chaos of Renaissance Italy. Yet behind the poetry and marble, a new kind of rule was forming, subtle, invisible, but absolute. The Medici no longer ruled through the public square. They ruled through the heart of the people, through the beauty of art, the rhythm of gold, and the power of memory. Lorenzo understood what few rulers of his time ever did, that art could be a form of dominion. War might seize cities, but art could conquer time. So he poured the wealth of the Medici banks into the artists, thinkers, and poets who would immortalize his name. Florence became his canvas. Under his patronage, the greatest minds of the age flourished. Botticelli painted dreams on walls, Verrocchio sculpted the divine in marble, and a young apprentice named Leonardo da Vinci began to sketch the future in ink and shadow. Every brushstroke, every line of verse, was both an offering and an allegiance. The Medici palace itself transformed into a temple of genius. Within its courtyards, scholars debated philosophy as musicians played soft melodies that echoed through the evening air. The scent of wine and ink mingled, and ideas became currency. Lorenzo surrounded himself with a circle of brilliance. Angelo Poliziano, the poet who turned Latin into music, Marsilio Ficino, the the philosopher who resurrected Plato's ancient light, and Pico della Mirandola, the prodigy who dared to write that mankind could choose to be angel or beast. Together, they called themselves the Platonic Academy, and for a brief, miraculous moment, Florence became the mind of the world. But this golden age was not built on light alone. While Lorenzo's salons glittered with intellect and beauty, his power grew more ruthless in the shadows. The Medici Bank, once the pillar of Europe's economy, began to falter under the weight of lavish spending and political bribes. Lorenzo masked the decline through cunning manipulation, reshuffling debts, influencing foreign trade, and weaving alliances that kept the illusion alive. The art that dazzled Florence was bought with coin borrowed from the future. Yet few dared question him, for Lorenzo had mastered the art of perception. He made poverty look like patronage, decline look like destiny. Beyond the walls of Florence, the world was shifting. The Ottoman Empire loomed in the east, their ships darkening the Mediterranean. France and Spain eyed Italy with hungry ambition. And within the church, corruption reached new depths. Indulgences sold like merchandise, bishops trading power like merchants traded cloth. In this climate, Lorenzo's Florence seemed a sanctuary of beauty, an island of reason. But it was also a city under a spell, one woven by a man who understood that beauty could hide the scent of rot. Beneath the marble floors and painted ceilings, whispers spread. Some said the Medici had forgotten God. Others murmured that the wealth of the city was being drained to feed the vanity of its ruler. The Dominican friars spoke of sin in velvet robes and gold crowns. But Lorenzo believed himself chosen, not by divine right, but by intellect. He saw himself as a second Augustus, guiding a new Rome through the power of enlightenment. His court glowed with poetry and pleasure. Tournaments were held in his honor. Processions filled the streets with music, and festivals dazzled the commoners who adored him. He wrote verses himself, love poems and philosophical musings, which he recited among friends under torchlight. To the people, he was Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. But to his enemies, he was something more dangerous. A man who had turned Florence into his stage and made all of them his audience. Yet even as Florence danced beneath his light, Lorenzo could feel the shadows lengthening. His bank's overseas branches, in London, Bruges, and Rome, began to collapse one by one. Bad loans and embezzlement eroded the empire built by his grandfather Cosimo. The Medici fortune, once boundless, began to slip like sand through his fingers. To maintain his image, Lorenzo turned increasingly to political control rather than financial strength. He manipulated elections, silenced dissent, and filled the government with loyalists who owed their rise to his favor. The Republic of Florence, once a beacon of civic freedom, was now a monarchy in all but name. Still, his charm was irresistible. Even those who knew they were being controlled could not help but love him. He gave Florence its identity, its art, its glory, its pride. To oppose him felt like betraying the city itself. But history has a cruel habit. It always asks what lies beneath the beauty. And in the case of Lorenzo, that answer was debt, secrecy, and the slow decay of a dynasty that could not stop expanding its reflection in the mirror. The late 1480s brought new tremors. A strange figure began to preach in the streets, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. His sermons were fire and thunder, calling for repentance, denouncing the vanity of the rich, and warning that Florence would burn if it did not return to God. At first, Lorenzo dismissed him as a fanatic, a curiosity for the masses. But Savonarola's voice carried the weight of prophecy. The crowds grew larger. His words, like sparks, began to fall into the dry grass of a weary city. In the palace, Lorenzo's health began to fail. The stress of politics, the endless intrigues, and perhaps the guilt of too many compromises took their toll. He withdrew more often into his gardens, surrounded by poets and philosophers, as if trying to hold onto the world he had built from ideas and dreams. Florence still glittered, but the glow had changed, softer, sadder, touched with the melancholy of things that cannot last. Lorenzo's letters from this time are filled with both wisdom and weariness. "We are all dust," he wrote to a friend, "and yet, in dust, There is design. It was the confession of a man who had seen too much power, too much beauty, too much blood. He knew that art could immortalize him, but not save him. The frescoes and statues would stand long after the debts came due, after the priests rose in judgment, after the dynasty cracked beneath its own magnificence. As his illness deepened, Lorenzo called for Savonarola, the very man who had condemned his way of life, to come to his bedside. No one knows exactly what passed between them. Some say Savonarola demanded that Lorenzo repent for his sins against Florence and return the city to the people. Others claim Lorenzo smiled faintly and turned his gaze to the ceiling, where light streamed through a high window, golden and distant. A poet to the end, he may have whispered one last verse to himself: "All things fade, but beauty remains." When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, the bells of Florence tolled as they had not since the day of the conspiracy. The city mourned not just a man but an era. The Renaissance would continue, but something had shifted. The harmony between power and art, between gold and faith, had broken. The Medici had climbed higher than any family before them, and from that height there was only one direction left to fall. The death of Lorenzo de' Medici in 1492 marked not just the passing of a man, but the end of Florence's golden illusion. For decades, the city had glimmered like a jewel, its art and philosophy masking the machinery of control that kept the Medici throne intact. But without Lorenzo's charisma and intellect, the delicate balance between beauty and power began to fracture. The Renaissance, so long sustained by his vision, was entering its twilight, and the Medici legacy, built on centuries of cunning and patronage, began to tremble beneath the weight of its own perfection. Lorenzo's eldest son, Piero, inherited everything: the titles, the wealth, the prestige, but none of his father's subtlety. Where Lorenzo was measured and wise, Piero was rash, vain, and impulsive. He was known to the people as Piero the Unfortunate, though the name came later, after his missteps had turned Florence's admiration into disgust. At just 21, he took control of a city that no longer believed in divine right, only in competence. And Piero, tragically, had none. In the months after Lorenzo's death, Florence felt adrift. The city's bankers whispered of unpaid loans. Artists and philosophers, once sustained by Lorenzo's generosity, looked elsewhere for patrons. Even the clergy seemed restless. And into this uncertainty came a voice that thundered like judgment itself: Savonarola. The Dominican friar who had once denounced the vanity of the Medici from the pulpit now became the voice of Florence's conscience. His sermons at the Cathedral of San Marco drew crowds so vast that people stood in the streets to hear him. He spoke not of politics, but of apocalypse. He warned that God's wrath was coming for Florence, for its greed, for its art, for its idols. At first, Piero ignored him. He believed the church had always been something to manage, not fear. But Savonarola's influence grew faster than anyone expected. His fiery prophecies seemed to come true with uncanny precision. When the French King Charles VIII announced his plan to invade Italy in 1494, claiming the throne of Naples, Savonarola declared it was divine punishment, the scourge of God sent to cleanse the land of its sins. The people trembled. The French army swept into Italy like a storm, thousands of soldiers armed with new and terrible weapons. Cannons that could shatter stone walls in a single shot. City after city fell before them. Florence, wealthy but defenseless, waited in terror. Piero, desperate to save himself, decided to negotiate with Charles. But where Lorenzo had once faced kings and popes with the eloquence of a statesman, Piero groveled. He surrendered Florentine fortresses, promised tribute, and opened the city's gates to the invaders, all without consulting the government or the people. It was the final insult. The Florentines, who had tolerated Medici rule because it was wrapped in dignity and brilliance, could not forgive humiliation. When Piero returned from his disastrous meeting, the doors of the Palazzo Vecchio were barred against him. Crowds gathered in the streets, shouting for his blood. In the chaos, Piero fled the city with his family, slipping away under cover of night. The dynasty that had ruled Florence for nearly 60 years was gone in an instant, cast out by the very people who once worshipped it. The next morning, the streets erupted in jubilation. Statues of the Medici were toppled, their coats of arms torn down and burned. The bells rang, not for mourning but for liberation. Florence declared itself a republic once again. And at its spiritual center stood Savonarola, no longer just a preacher, but the prophet of a new moral order. What followed was a transformation unlike anything Europe had seen. Under Savonarola's influence, Florence became a city of penitence. Lavish feasts were replaced by prayers. Music and poetry gave way to sermons and scripture. The same people who once paraded in gold and silk now wore plain robes and confessed their sins in public squares. Taverns closed, gambling was outlawed, and even certain forms of art were condemned as sinful vanity. The Renaissance, that wild, intoxicating celebration of human genius, was being undone by its own conscience. Then came the bonfire of the vanities. On a cold February night in 1497, Savonarola's followers gathered in the Piazza della Signoria. They built a towering pyre of worldly temptations: mirrors, jewelry, cosmetics, musical instruments, and paintings deemed immoral. Artists like Botticelli, once adored by the Medici, watched as their own works were thrown into the flames. The sky above Florence glowed with the light of self-purification or destruction, depending on who was watching. To many, it seemed the city had gone mad. The very beauty that had made Florence the heart of the Renaissance was being burned away. Savonarola's sermons grew darker, filled with visions of apocalypse and divine wrath. He spoke as if Florence were the new Jerusalem, chosen to lead the world into a new age of faith. But the Pope in Rome saw something else, a dangerous fanatic defying papal authority and threatening the delicate balance of power. Pope Alexander VI, a Borgia with ambitions as vast as his vices, excommunicated Savonarola in 1497. Yet the friar refused to step down. He claimed he answered only to God. For a time, the people still believed him. But famine and plague soon struck Florence, and the prophecies that had once seemed divine began to sound like madness. The city, exhausted by endless repentance, turned against its prophet. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, and condemned as a heretic. On May 23, he was led to the very same square where his bonfires had burned. The crowds that had once wept at his words now shouted for his death. The executioners tied him to a wooden cross, alongside two of his closest followers. As the flames rose, a wind carried the smell of burning flesh through the streets, the scent of another Florence dying. The ashes of Savonarola were scattered in the Arno, so that no relics would remain. When the smoke cleared, Florence was silent. The Medici were gone, the prophet was dead, and the Republic stood alone, proud, scarred, and uncertain. For the first time in generations, the city belonged to no one. But power abhors a vacuum. Across Italy, forces were already moving to fill the void. The French remained in the north, the Spanish in the south, and Rome seethed with political intrigue. The Medici, though scattered, were not finished. Piero wandered from court to court, begging for aid to reclaim his city, while his younger brother Giovanni, the future Pope Leo X, studied theology in Rome, quietly waiting for the tides of fate to turn. The city of Florence, once the cradle of beauty, now stood as a monument to impermanence, a reminder that power, no matter how gilded, always fades. The statues still gleamed in the sunlight, but their faces seemed different now, not serene but haunted. It was as if the marble itself remembered the fire. For the people of Florence, it was a time of reckoning. The Medici had ruled through brilliance, Savonarola through faith, and both had led the city into ruin. Yet in the silence that followed, one truth endured. Florence was never truly free. The same forces that had shaped its destiny, ambition, greed, and the hunger for meaning, still moved unseen beneath its cobblestones. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, the Medici waited, patient as shadows, certain that history would call them home again. In the years following Savonarola's execution, Florence entered a strange twilight, a republic without faith, a people without certainty. The city that had once been the beating heart of the Renaissance now drifted in exhaustion, like a candle burning low after too many nights of brilliance. The Medici had been driven out, their name cursed and their palaces looted, but their shadow lingered. Even in exile, they haunted Florence. Their enemies ruled, their portraits were hidden, and their symbols were scraped from the walls. Yet their legend, paradoxically, only grew. The Medici had become ghosts that refused to die. Piero, the exiled son of Lorenzo, wandered through the courts of Europe seeking allies to reclaim his home. But he was a man born to privilege, not perseverance. His charm faded, his influence dwindled, and when he drowned in 1503 during a skirmish in the Garigliano River, few mourned him. Yet elsewhere the bloodline endured. Lorenzo's younger son, Giovanni, had chosen a different path, the church. Unlike his father, who had ruled with intellect and art, Giovanni ruled through patience. While Florence stumbled between factions and foreign occupations, Giovanni quietly built a network of influence in Rome that stretched from cardinals to kings. By the early 1500s, Italy was a chessboard of ambition. France and Spain fought bitterly for dominance, while the Papal States struggled to maintain authority amid corruption and war. Florence, now under a fragile republican government, was caught between these powers, changing sides like a gambler switching tables. Every victory brought ruin. Every peace was temporary. The spirit that had once filled the city with music and invention now seemed replaced by suspicion and fatigue. Then, in 1512, the tide shifted once again. Spanish troops, fighting under the banner of Pope Julius II, marched into Tuscany. Behind their advance moved emissaries carrying promises and gold, the quiet work of Giovanni de' Medici, who had risen to the rank of cardinal. Through cunning diplomacy and calculated bribery, he convinced the invaders to restore order in Florence, which in practice meant restoring the Medici. The Republican government crumbled. Within weeks, the red banners of the family once again flew from the Palazzo Vecchio. After 18 years in exile, the Medici had returned. But Florence was not the same city they had lost. The people greeted them not with celebration but with wary silence. Giovanni entered quietly, his robes scarlet against the gray stone streets. He did not speak of vengeance, only stability. He promised peace and forgiveness, though behind his calm eyes burned the knowledge that the Medici had learned their lesson. Never again would they allow sentiment to endanger their survival. From now on, their rule would be as much about control as culture. Giovanni's younger cousin, Giuliano, was named head of the Florentine state, though the real power remained with Giovanni himself. He ruled from afar, through letters and envoys, his influence spreading like invisible roots. In 1513, his patience was rewarded beyond all imagination. Pope Julius II, the warrior pontiff who had dominated Italy's politics, died. The conclave that followed was tense and divided, filled with bribes, threats, and whispered alliances. But when the smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, the world gasped at the name it carried, Giovanni de' Medici. At only 37 years old, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent had become Pope Leo X. It was a triumph beyond the dreams of any banker or politician. A Medici now sat on the throne of St. Peter, wearing the triple crown of papal authority. Florence, once ruled by money and art, now ruled Christendom. God has given us the papacy. Leo is said to have remarked upon his election, "Let us enjoy it." The words, half jest, half confession, would come to define his reign. As Pope, Leo X embodied the contradictions of his family. Pious yet extravagant, cultured yet corrupt, visionary yet blind to consequence. He transformed the Vatican into a palace of splendor, commissioning Raphael to paint its chambers and Michelangelo to design the tombs of his ancestors. Banquets rivaled coronations. Festivals filled Rome with music, theater, and laughter. The Medici aesthetic, that blend of intellect, opulence, and control, reached its zenith. Yet beneath the surface, the church was rotting. Leo's indulgent lifestyle drained the papal treasury, forcing him to seek new sources of income. His solution would alter history forever. To fund his projects, he expanded the sale of indulgences. the church's promise of forgiveness in exchange for money. It was a scheme as old as sin itself, but under Leo, it reached unprecedented heights. Across Europe, preachers declared that the souls of the dead could be freed from purgatory with the drop of a coin. The gold poured in, but so did outrage. In Germany, a monk named Martin Luther watched the corruption with disgust. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg church, igniting the Protestant Reformation. Leo dismissed Luther as a madman, a drunken German who would sober up and recant. But he underestimated the fire he had sparked. The movement spread like plague, carried by the newly invented printing press. Pamphlets denouncing papal greed flooded Europe. The image of the Medici Pope, fat, laughing, feasting on the wealth of Christendom, became a symbol of everything the reformers despised. Meanwhile, Florence prospered under the renewed Medici rule, but the old spirit of independence was gone. The Republic had become a memory, replaced by a quiet acceptance of power. Art continued, but its purpose shifted. Where once it celebrated human potential, it now glorified divine authority, or rather, the authority of those who claimed to speak for God. Leo's reign was brief but brilliant. In 1521, he died suddenly, perhaps from malaria, perhaps from exhaustion. His death was as extravagant as his life. On the night he passed, Rome was preparing for another feast. His last words, according to one account, were, "Since God has given us all this, let us enjoy it." With his death, the Medici papacy faltered, but the family's hold on power did not. Another cousin, Giulio de' Medici, soon ascended as Pope Clement VII. His reign would plunge both Florence and Rome into catastrophe. As the new century dawned, the balance of the Renaissance was collapsing. The Reformation had fractured Europe. Empires rose and fell in bloody succession. And yet, through every storm the Medici endured, not because they were blessed, but because they had learned to adapt. They had survived assassins, popes, prophets, and kings. But the world they had built, a world of beauty masking corruption, of power cloaked in art, was beginning to crumble. Florence had birthed genius and tyranny in equal measure. It had raised the Medici to the heavens and watched them fall into the flames. And still, their story was not over. Because history, like Florence itself, does not forget those who reshape it. The Medici were no longer just a family, they were a dynasty. And dynasties, no matter how often destroyed, have a way of finding their way back into the light. By the time Giulio de' Medici rose to the papacy in 1523, taking the name Clement VII, the world that his cousin Leo X had reveled in was already on the edge of chaos. The Renaissance dream, the glittering illusion of harmony between faith, art, and power, had begun to unravel. Across Europe, Martin Luther's defiance had torn the Christian world in two. Empires clashed, kings betrayed popes, and Italy, that patchwork of brilliance and greed, had become a battlefield once more. Yet at the center of this storm stood another Medici, calm, patient, and calculating. Clement was not a man of joy or splendor like Leo. He was cautious, haunted, and perpetually uncertain. And in his hesitation, the dynasty that had conquered Florence and Rome would face one of the darkest catastrophes in its history, the sack of Rome. Clement had inherited a papacy already weakened by his cousin's excesses. The church's coffers were nearly empty, its authority crumbling under the pressure of reformers and rival monarchs. France and Spain, the two greatest powers in Europe, were locked in an endless struggle for dominance over Italy. Clement's instinct was always to balance, to mediate, to keep peace by playing one side against the other. But in the brutal chessboard of 16th century politics, hesitation was death. At first, Clement aligned himself with France, hoping to counter the growing influence of Emperor Charles V, ruler of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. But Charles was no mere king. He was a colossus, the most powerful man in Christendom, whose armies stretched from the Netherlands to the New World. The rivalry between Charles and Francis I plunged Italy into war once again, with Florence and the Papal States caught in the middle. In 1525, Clement's gamble shattered. The French army was annihilated at the Battle of Pavia, and King Francis himself was captured. The balance of power collapsed overnight. The emperor's forces now dominated northern Italy, and the pope found himself surrounded by enemies. Terrified, Clement switched allegiance, attempting to reconcile with Charles. But the emperor's trust, once lost, was not easily regained. In the shadows of Europe's palaces, diplomats whispered that the pope was a coward, a politician without conviction. They weren't entirely wrong. Clement's intelligence was immense, his sense of self-preservation unmatched, but he lacked his ancestors' audacity. Lorenzo had faced assassins in his own cathedral. Leo had challenged nations with laughter and gold. Clement, by contrast, wavered. His heart was that of a banker's son, cautious, calculating, afraid of risk. In 1526, fearing Spanish dominance, he joined the League of Cognac, a desperate alliance with France, Venice, Milan, and Florence against Charles V. It was a reckless move, and the emperor's response was merciless. His unpaid soldiers, Germans, Spaniards, and Italian mercenaries alike, mutinied, demanding plunder as their reward. With banners bearing the imperial eagle, they began to march south toward Rome. The Pope dismissed the warnings. He believed the Holy City was untouchable, protected by its sacred aura and ancient walls. But what approached was not an army of devotion, it was a horde of hunger. Among them were Lutheran mercenaries who despised the Pope as Antichrist, Spaniards enraged by unpaid wages, and Italians disillusioned by endless wars. As they advanced, reports spread of towns pillaged, churches defiled, priests murdered. Still, Clement hesitated to act, trapped between fear and disbelief. Then, in May of 1527, the unimaginable happened. At dawn on May 6th, the imperial troops reached the gates of Rome. The city's defenders were few, a handful of papal soldiers and the Swiss Guard, loyal to the last. The fog of morning rolled over the Tiber, cloaking the approach of death. When the cannons finally roared, the walls of Rome trembled. Within hours, the Eternal City was breached. The Swiss Guard made their final stand on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, fighting to the last man to protect the Pope's escape. Their captain, Caspar Royst, fell beneath a storm of pikes and bullets, his blood staining the marble floor. As chaos engulfed the city, Clement fled through a secret passage, the Passetto di Borgo, a narrow, ancient corridor linking the Vatican to the fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo. Behind him, the apocalypse began. Rome, once the center of the Christian world, became a vision of hell. Soldiers rampaged through the streets, breaking into palaces and churches, dragging nuns and priests into the open. Sacred relics were smashed, chalices melted for gold, and frescoes defaced by drunken hands. The air filled with screams and smoke. Corpses floated in the Tiber as fire devoured the skyline. For 8 days the city was ravaged, looted, desecrated, violated. The blood of saints and sinners mingled in the gutters. From the fortress, Clement watched in horror. He could see the fires from his window, hear the cries echoing through the ruins of his own kingdom. The Pope, the man who claimed dominion over souls, was now a prisoner in his own city. For 6 months he remained besieged in Castel Sant'Angelo, negotiating his release like a banker haggling over interest. When he was finally allowed to leave, he emerged a ghost. The Medici Pope who had once ruled the world now ruled only ashes. The sack of Rome marked the symbolic end of the Renaissance. It was as if God himself had turned away from the glittering illusions of human grandeur. Artists fled, scholars scattered, and the confidence that had defined an age dissolved into fear. The dream of human perfection, so carefully built by generations of Medici patronage, lay buried beneath the ruins of the Eternal City. Yet even in this devastation, the Medici instinct for survival endured. Clement, shamed but unbroken, turned his focus back to Florence, where rebellion once again simmered. The Florentines, sensing weakness, expelled the Medici from power in 1527, declaring the return of the Republic. For 3 years they held out against imperial forces. But Clement, now reconciled with Charles V, demanded vengeance. In 1530, imperial troops besieged Florence itself. The city that had once been the cradle of art and liberty now became a fortress under siege. Hunger and disease swept through its streets. Still, the Florentines refused to surrender until finally, after 11 months of starvation, the walls fell. The Medici returned once more, this time not as patrons, but as conquerors. Clement installed his young relative Alessandro as Duke of Florence, ending centuries of republican freedom. In that moment, the Renaissance spirit of Florence died completely. What remained was power, cold, absolute, and unadorned. The Medici, who had once ruled through persuasion and beauty, now ruled through force and fear. Clement VII would die in 1534, exhausted and alone. Yet before his death, he arranged one final stroke of dynastic genius, the marriage of his niece, Catherine de' Medici, to Henry, the son of the French king. That union would carry the Medici blood into the royal house of France, ensuring that, though their city had fallen, their legacy would haunt Europe for generations to come. The sack of Rome had stripped the world of its illusions. It revealed the Medici not as gods of the Renaissance, but as survivors, flawed, mortal, yet indestructible. And as Clement's tomb was sealed in the quiet of St. Peter's, the echo of fire still lingered in the stones of Rome, whispering that even the mightiest dynasties are built upon ashes. When Clement VI's body was laid to rest in 1534, the Medici name seemed destined to fade into the dim corridors of memory. Florence, weary and subdued, was no longer the fiery republic it once was. The Renaissance had burned itself out, leaving only the pale glow of power and the heavy scent of compromise. But in France, a new spark flickered. A young woman, barely 14, stood at the altar beside a prince, her face pale beneath her jeweled veil. Her name was Catherine de' Medici, and though she seemed small, almost fragile, her bloodline carried the weight of generations of cunning, survival, and ambition. Her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the son of King Francis I, had been arranged by Pope Clement himself before his death. It was a diplomatic union, a way to bind France to the Medici and secure their place in the shifting power games of Europe. Few in the French court welcomed her. The great nobles whispered that she was the daughter of bankers, not blue blood. Even her husband ignored her, preferring the company of his elegant mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Yet beneath Catherine's quiet demeanor lay the same cold intelligence that had built empires and toppled republics. She was, in many ways, the last and most dangerous Medici. Catherine's early years in France were years of humiliation. She had no power, no children, and little affection from her husband or his father, King Francis. But she watched, always watched. She learned the art of reading faces, of listening to silences, of turning insult into advantage. When she finally bore children, 10 in total, her position strengthened. Her sons would one day sit on the throne of France, and through them, the Medici would shape an entire nation's destiny. In 1547, her husband ascended as King Henry II, and Catherine became Queen of France. Outwardly, she remained obedient, the loyal wife who deferred to her husband's mistress. But inside the palace walls, her influence began to weave like a spider's web. She placed loyal servants in key positions, forged alliances with powerful families, and began gathering information. Secrets that could be used later, when fortune shifted again. And it did. In 1559, a tragic accident changed everything. During a jousting tournament held to celebrate the peace between France and Spain, King Henry II insisted on competing despite omens of danger. His opponent's lance splintered, and a shard pierced the king's eye, driving into his brain. He lingered in agony for 10 days before dying, leaving Catherine as the mother of a 10-year-old boy who suddenly became King Francis II. At that moment, Catherine's true nature revealed itself. She seized control of the court, cloaking her authority in the guise of maternal care. But her enemies were legion. The powerful Guise family sought to dominate the young king, while Protestant nobles plotted rebellion from the shadows. France was on the brink of religious civil war, a conflict that would soon stain its soil with rivers of blood. When Francis II died unexpectedly in 1560, Catherine's second son, Charles IX, took the throne. He was only 10 years old, Catherine became regent, the real ruler of France. Her rise was complete. But the kingdom she inherited was fractured beyond repair. Protestants, known as Huguenots, demanded freedom of worship. Catholics demanded their extermination. Towns burned, families were slaughtered, and the air itself seemed poisoned with fanaticism. Catherine tried to walk the impossible line, to hold together a nation tearing itself apart. She summoned both factions to the royal court, urging tolerance, negotiation, reason. But like her ancestors before her, she understood that peace without power is a dream. She began to maneuver once more, not for ideals but for survival. Her court became infamous, a theater of intrigue, deception, and ritual. Astrologers, alchemists, and spies walked its corridors. Nostradamus himself was said to have visited Catherine, reading her the cryptic prophecies that haunted her sleep. She surrounded herself with mystery and fear, cultivating an aura of control that blended superstition and statecraft. Those who met her rarely forgot the gaze. Steady, unreadable, patient as time itself. Yet her greatest test came in 1572. For years, Catherine had struggled to secure a fragile peace between the warring religious factions. She arranged a political marriage between her Catholic daughter, Marguerite de Valois, and the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre, hoping to unite the realm. On August 18th, the royal wedding took place in Paris, bringing thousands of Huguenots to the capital for celebration. But beneath the surface of joy, tension simmered like a volcano ready to erupt. For days later, an assassination attempt on a Protestant leader, Admiral Coligny, failed, but suspicion immediately fell upon Catherine. The city teetered on the edge of chaos. Fearing retaliation and perhaps manipulated by her Catholic advisors, Catherine gave her silent consent to a preemptive strike. On the night of August 23rd, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled, and the gates of Paris were shut. What followed was one of the darkest nights in French history, the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre. Royal guards and Catholic mobs stormed through the streets, breaking into homes, slaughtering men, women, and children alike. The Seine ran red with blood as thousands were killed. Some estimates say as many as 10,000 across France. Catherine's role remains shrouded in ambiguity. Did she order the massacre or simply fail to stop it? History cannot decide. But one thing is certain. Her name was forever bound to that night of terror. In the years that followed, she continued to rule from the shadows, her sons weak and pliable, her power maintained by fear and calculation. Charles IX died young, tormented by guilt and nightmares of the massacre. His brother, Henry III, succeeded him, vain, volatile, and easily swayed by his mother's counsel. Catherine, aging but unyielding, became the iron matriarch of a dying dynasty. Her final years were marked by exhaustion and melancholy. She had outlived her enemies, but also her dreams. The France she tried to hold together was collapsing into endless war. When she died in 1589, the Medici line in France effectively ended, yet her influence lingered in the blood of kings, in the architecture of the French court, in the very nature of royal politics itself. Catherine de' Medici was not merely a queen. She was the embodiment of her family's legacy, the eternal paradox of the Medici name. Patron of the arts and mother of murderers, builder of peace and architect of massacre, she carried Florence's darkness into the heart of France. And as her body was laid to rest, the whispers returned, that the Medici had always been guided by something deeper than politics or power, something ancient, hidden, and cursed. Whether that was fate or simply the nature of ambition itself, no one could say. But wherever the Medici name appeared, beauty and blood always followed. By the end of the 16th century, the Medici family had achieved what few dynasties in history could claim. They had risen from merchants to monarchs, shaped the papacy, and left their fingerprints across the cultural heart of Europe. Yet within their home city of Florence, a new chapter was beginning, one no longer defined by merchants' ledgers or artists' brushes, but by dukes, spies, and silent fortresses. When Alessandro de' Medici was made Duke of Florence in 1532, the republic that had once given birth to humanism was gone. The people had traded liberty for stability, and the Medici, ever adaptable, transformed themselves from bankers into rulers. But with this transformation came a new kind of darkness. Alessandro was the first to wear the title duke, but he ruled more like a tyrant than a prince of the Renaissance. El Moro, they called him the Moor, for his dark complexion and even darker temperament. Rumors swirled that he was the illegitimate son of Pope Clement VII and a slave woman, though such whispers were as much weapons of politics as gossip. Whatever his parentage, Alessandro ruled Florence with a heavy hand. He surrounded himself with mercenaries, silenced his critics, and filled the city's palaces with secret pleasure chambers and watchful guards. To the people, he was the shadow of Medici glory, the embodiment of what their golden age had become, gilded on the outside, rotting within. But Florence had not forgotten how to conspire. In 1537, Alessandro invited his cousin Lorenzino de' Medici to a private evening. Lorenzino, charming and cultured, had long flattered Alessandro, gaining his trust. That night, behind closed doors, he murdered the duke with his own hands. The city awoke to chaos. The tyrant was dead. Yet what followed was not the rebirth of the Republic, as some had hoped, but the rise of a new ruler, one far more cunning and enduring. Cosimo de' Medici, a distant relative of the main line, barely 17 years old. Cosimo began as a figurehead, a pawn the Florentine elite believed they could control. They were wrong. The boy duke moved with quiet precision, studying the game before making his move. He rebuilt the Medici army, secured alliances with the Emperor Charles V, and crushed the last Republican forces at the Battle of Montemerlo. By the time the smoke cleared, Florence was his body, soul, and memory. Cosimo declared himself Duke of all Tuscany, uniting the fractured city-states under his rule. But Cosimo was no tyrant in the crude sense. He understood the deeper game his ancestors had mastered, the control of image, legacy, and destiny. To rebuild the Medici myth, he turned again to art and architecture. He commissioned Giorgio Vasari, the court painter and architect, to glorify the family through a vast program of renewal. Palaces were remodeled, frescoes painted, chapels adorned, each depicting the Medici not as merchants or bankers, but as divinely appointed rulers. Under Cosimo's direction, Florence became a theater of symbolism. The Uffizi was built not as a museum, as it would later become, but as government offices, a monumental space that displayed Medici power through classical harmony. He transformed the Palazzo Vecchio into a ducal residence, filling its halls with allegories of justice, virtue, and strength, all bearing the subtle message that the Medici alone could protect Florence from chaos. Yet behind the marble and frescoes, Cosimo ruled with the cold precision of a banker counting debts. He crushed dissent ruthlessly, filled the dungeons beneath the Palazzo Vecchio with political prisoners, and used spies to monitor even his closest advisors. The Medici Bank was gone, but the family's obsession with control remained. Florence, once alive with debate and discovery, became disciplined, ordered. A court where art served propaganda and beauty concealed fear. Cosimo's ambitions reached beyond Florence. He secured from the Pope the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany, elevating the Medici from mere dukes to near kings. This was the ultimate transformation. The family that had once balanced books now held crowns. He expanded trade, strengthened the navy, and turned Livorno into a thriving port city, ensuring Tuscany's wealth for generations. His reign brought prosperity and stability, but at a price. The creative spark that had defined Florence dimmed. The city's artists no longer painted out of inspiration, but obligation. And yet Cosimo was haunted not by rebellion, but by legacy. He knew that power, once achieved, must be embalmed in memory to survive. He built the Medici Chapel, a marble mausoleum of astonishing beauty, to house the bodies of his ancestors and himself. Inside, under Michelangelo's sculptures of night and day, dawn and dusk, the Medici slept in eternal stone. Every curve of the marble whispered the same message: we are eternal. When Cosimo died in 1574, his son, Francesco I, succeeded him. But the new Grand Duke was a different kind of ruler, reclusive, melancholic, obsessed with alchemy and science. The Medici court turned inward, becoming a place of strange experiments and whispered rumors. Francesco filled the Palazzo Vecchio with laboratories, collecting strange minerals, distilling poisons, and seeking the secrets of immortality. His wife, Joanna of Austria, was deeply unhappy in Florence, isolated by a court that viewed her as a foreign intrusion. Their marriage was cold, their palace haunted by silence. Then came Bianca Capello, Francesco's mistress, later his wife, a Venetian beauty whose intelligence matched her ambition. Her influence over the Grand Duke was absolute, and the Florentine elite loathed her for it. The court became a cauldron of intrigue once again, echoing the treacheries of earlier generations. In 1587, both Francesco and Bianca died suddenly at the Villa Medici in Poggio a Caiano. Officially, it was said they succumbed to malaria, but whispers of poison, a favorite Medici weapon, spread quickly. Some said Francesco's brother, Ferdinand, had orchestrated their deaths to seize the throne. If true, it was merely another verse in the Medici song of survival. Ferdinand, a cardinal before his brother's death, abandoned his clerical robes to become Grand Duke Ferdinand I. He restored order, improved the navy, and reopened Florence to trade. Under him, the Medici regained a measure of their former respect, not as tyrants or monsters, but as rulers of efficiency and culture. Yet even Ferdinand knew the truth that all Medici learned. Power could be preserved, but never trusted. In the quiet chambers of the Pitti Palace, where generations of Medici had lived and plotted, the walls themselves seemed to breathe history, the triumphs and betrayals, the wealth and ruin. The family had survived assassination, exile, rebellion, and the wrath of empires. But beneath the grandeur, one truth lingered like incense. Every Medici victory carried a curse, and every crown was paid for in blood. The line that had begun with merchants and dreamers was now a dynasty of dukes and ghosts. Florence was no longer the beating heart of human genius. It was a reliquary, a beautiful tomb preserving the memory of greatness long gone. And in the shadow of its marble domes, the last Medici heirs prepared for a new century, one that would test the limits of even their legendary will to endure. By the time the 17th century dawned over Florence, the Medici had long ceased to be the restless merchants or daring patrons who once gambled their fortunes on artists and popes. They were now rulers in the truest and perhaps most tragic sense, insulated by luxury, imprisoned by legacy. Their palaces gleamed with gold and marble, yet the blood that once pulsed with ambition had grown cold. The Renaissance had ended, leaving in its wake a dynasty haunted by its own grandeur. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, once vibrant under Cosimo and Ferdinand, began to drift, its rulers more concerned with alchemy, marriages, and superstition than the pulse of their people. At the heart of this slow decay was Ferdinand I's son, Cosimo II de' Medici. Unlike his ancestors, Cosimo II was a gentle ruler, intelligent, deeply curious, and plagued by ill health. He ascended to the throne in 1609, bringing with him a new era of cautious peace. He inherited not only his father's dukedom but also the lingering aura of divine kingship that the Medici had so carefully crafted. Cosimo II's greatest achievement would not be conquest or politics, but his patronage of a single man whose discoveries would reshape the world, Galileo Galilei. Florence, under Cosimo's rule, became the stage for one of the most profound clashes between faith and reason in human history. Galileo, the Florentine scientist whose telescope pierced the heavens, dedicated his discoveries to the young duke, naming the moons of Jupiter the Medicean stars in his honor. It was a clever gesture, blending science and flattery, intellect and politics, and it secured Galileo's protection under the Medici banner. For a time, Florence shone again, not with the light of divine inspiration but with the cold brilliance of knowledge. But even genius could not escape the weight of the Medici curse. As Galileo's fame grew, so did suspicion from Rome. The Church, already shaken by the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, viewed his findings as heresy. When the Inquisition summoned him, the Medici were forced into silence. Cosimo, ill and politically vulnerable, could do little to defend his friend. In 1633, Galileo was condemned and forced to recant, muttering his famous defiance, "E per si move." And yet it moves. That quiet rebellion echoed far beyond the scientist's cell. It symbolized the final break between the Renaissance dream, born under Medici patronage, and the tightening grip of dogma that followed. Florence, once the city of freedom and inquiry, now watched its light dim under the shadow of its own past. Cosimo too died young, in 1621, leaving behind a fragile duchy and a dynasty slowly turning inward. His widow, Maria Maddalena of Austria, ruled as regent alongside his mother, Christina of Lorraine. Together, they smothered the court in religious devotion and ritual, transforming Florence from a city of thinkers into one of superstition and ceremony. Where Lorenzo the Magnificent had welcomed poets and philosophers, the new Medici court hosted confessors and mystics. The change was subtle but irreversible, a quiet suffocation of the spirit that had once defined the city. Their son, Ferdinand II, inherited a world far different from the one his ancestors had conquered. The 30 Years' War ravaged Europe, and the once mighty Italian states had become pawns in the hands of foreign empires. Ferdinand tried to revive Florence's glory through science and art, establishing laboratories, academies, and manufactories. Yet these efforts felt more like echoes than rebirths, brilliant gestures in a city that no longer led the world but merely reflected it. Still, Ferdinand's reign had its moments of grace. Under his rule, the Accademia del Cimento was founded, one of the first scientific societies in Europe, inspired by Galileo's methods. The Medici still had wealth, still commanded respect, but the world's gaze had shifted elsewhere. Spain, France, and England were now the great powers, and Florence, once the jewel of civilization, was content to rest in the soft twilight of memory. After Ferdinand II's death in 1670, his son, Cosimo III, ascended the throne, a man whose reign would come to symbolize the final unraveling of the Medici legacy. Cosimo III was devout to the point of obsession, tormented by guilt and paranoia, and utterly unfit for the age of enlightenment dawning around him. He filled the palace with priests and confessors, enforcing moral codes that stifled what little joy remained in Florence. Public festivals were banned, artists fled, and the once brilliant Tuscan court became a mausoleum of faded grandeur. Cosimo's reign was long, too long, lasting 53 years. Under his rule, the Medici reputation withered into mockery. Foreign ambassadors described him as a ghost wandering his own palace, muttering prayers and issuing decrees no one obeyed. His personal life was no less tragic. His wife, Marguerite Louise d'Orleans, loathed him and fled back to France, leaving him humiliated before the courts of Europe. His children were weak, sickly, and uninterested in rule. Only one, John Gaston de Medici, would inherit the title. By the early 18th century, the Medici dynasty, once the most formidable family in Europe, was reduced to a few melancholy figures pacing through echoing palaces filled with the relics of their ancestors. The great bank that had built Florence was long gone. The artists, the thinkers, the visionaries, all replaced by priests and bureaucrats. The Medici coat of arms, once a symbol of vitality and creation, now hung like a funerary emblem over a dying line. Cosimo III, realizing the inevitability of extinction, tried desperately to secure the family's legacy. He commissioned endless portraits, genealogies, and chronicles, as if words and paint could stop the erosion of time. He even petitioned the great powers of Europe to recognize his daughter, Anna Maria Luisa, as his heir, a last attempt to preserve the Medici name. But politics had no room for sentiment. When Cosimo III finally died in 1723, he left behind a hollow throne and a fractured state. His son, John Gaston, ascended reluctantly, a tired man presiding over the ghost of an empire. He had little interest in power or ceremony. The court fell silent. The palaces gathered dust. Florence, once illuminated by genius, now glimmered faintly like a candle at the end of its wick. The Medici had once believed they could cheat death through art, architecture, science, and gold. But now, they faced the truth that no dynasty can escape. Time devours all. And in the dim corridors of the Pitti Palace, where the faces of ancestors stared down from the walls, the echo of their triumphs seemed almost mocking. The Medici had conquered Florence, the church, and even the imagination of humanity. But in conquering all, they had destroyed the very spirit that had made them great. Theirs was the fate of all empires, to rise from brilliance and fall into silence. When John Gaston de' Medici took the throne in 1723, the glory of his family was already a ghost. Florence, once the beating heart of Europe's rebirth, had grown quiet. The great workshops of artists and architects that had once filled its streets were now abandoned or converted into salons for gossiping nobles. The Medici palaces, the Pitti, the Palazzo Vecchio, the Villa di Castello, still gleamed with marble and gold, but they were mausoleums of memory rather than centers of power. The city that had given birth to the Renaissance now seemed embalmed, preserved under glass by the very dynasty that had once made it live. John Gaston inherited not a kingdom of brilliance, but a relic. He was a strange, tragic figure, intelligent, melancholy, and utterly detached from the rituals of courtly life. His father, Cosimo III, had crushed the spirit of Florence beneath decades of oppressive piety and moral decrees. John Gaston, by contrast, despised religion, ceremony, and the suffocating hypocrisy of his predecessors. He refused to attend Mass, rarely left his bedchamber, and surrounded himself with philosophers, musicians, and drunken companions who shared his contempt for the old ways. To the public, he was a scandal. To himself, perhaps, a man too tired to pretend any longer. From the moment of his coronation, it was clear that John Gaston had no illusions of restoring Medici grandeur. The coffers were nearly empty, the state weak, and the dynasty itself nearing extinction. He abolished the harsh moral laws his father had imposed, reopening theaters, easing restrictions on the people, and even reducing taxes, but these acts of mercy came less from vision than indifference. "Let them live as they wish," he once said, "for I have no wish to play God." Florence, starved of joy for half a century, briefly came alive again, but it was a flicker, not a flame. Behind the palace walls, the Grand Duke lived in isolation. His body was frail, his spirit weary. Servants whispered of his nightly revels. Strange gatherings of musicians, jesters, and outcasts in the Pitti Palace, where the aging ruler would drink and reminisce about a world he had never truly known. The courtiers mocked him, calling him the melancholy prince. Yet even in his decadence, there was a tragic dignity. John Gaston was not cruel, nor ambitious, nor vain. He was simply the last man standing at the end of a story too grand for any mortal to sustain. The decline of the Medici was not merely political, it was existential. Their rise had been built on a belief in human greatness, in the power of intellect and will to shape destiny. But after centuries of rule, that belief had curdled into disillusionment. The Florentines no longer saw their dukes as visionaries, but as relics of a vanished age. The Renaissance dream had become a burden too heavy for flesh and blood to bear. John Gaston, in his strange way, seemed to understand this. He once ordered the court painters to stop depicting him in the traditional Medici style, the regal posture, the serene gaze, the divine light. Instead, he wanted honesty. One surviving portrait shows him pale, heavy-lidded, and tired, seated in shadow rather than splendor. It is not the face of a ruler, it is the face of an ending. As his health declined, the question of succession loomed. John Gaston had no heirs. The Medici bloodline, which had once produced popes, queens, and princes, would die with him. The great powers of Europe began circling Tuscany like vultures, eager to claim the duchy once the last Medici fell. France, Spain, and Austria all put forward their candidates, treating Florence not as a living state but as a valuable corpse to be divided. In his final years, John Gaston grew more withdrawn, haunted by the thought that everything his family had built, the art, the palaces, the legacy, would pass into foreign hands. He avoided state matters entirely, retreating into his rooms, where he spent his days surrounded by books and his nights staring out at the gardens of Boboli. Visitors described him as kind yet distant, a man who spoke softly and smiled sadly when reminded of the past. "The Medici have lived too long," he once murmured, "and I too short to change them." When he died on July 9, 1737, at the age of 66, the bells of Florence tolled for the last of the Medici men. There were no great processions, no outpouring of public grief, only a solemn, almost embarrassed silence. The city that had once bowed before his ancestors barely looked up. With his death, the male line of the Medici came to an end after nearly 3 centuries of rule. But the family's story did not die entirely with him. John Gaston's sister, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, remained, the last surviving heir of the once mighty house. Intelligent, proud, and fiercely devoted to her lineage, she had watched from afar as her family decayed. Now, as the world turned the page on the Medici name, she resolved to protect what could still be saved. The European powers quickly installed a new ruler in Florence, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, future husband of Maria Theresa of Austria. The Grand Duchy passed to a foreign dynasty, as John Gaston had feared. The Medici palaces, estates, and treasures were all claimed as the property of the new rulers. Yet Anna Maria Luisa, refusing to let centuries of Florentine art vanish into exile, struck one final bargain, one that would define her as the guardian of her family's soul. In 1737, she signed what became known as the Family Pact. In it, she bequeathed all the Medici art collections, libraries, and treasures to the people of Florence, on one condition: that nothing should ever leave the city. Every painting, every sculpture, every manuscript was to remain forever within its walls, preserved for future generations. It was a last act of defiance and of love. Because of her, the Uffizi Gallery still holds Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Leonardo's Annunciation, and the countless masterpieces that once adorned Medici halls. Because of her, Florence remains not just a city of the past, but a living museum of the Renaissance. So when John Gaston's body was laid to rest in the Medici chapel beneath Michelangelo's marble guardians, night and day, dawn and dusk, it was not merely the death of a man, but the closing of an age. The Medici had risen from merchants to monarchs, shaped empires, and given the world its greatest art. And in their end, they performed one final miracle. They gave eternity to beauty. The marble sarcophagus gleams still, untouched by centuries. The silence of the chapel carries the echo of all their contradictions: ambition and faith, cruelty and genius, greed and grace. Beneath those stones lies not just a family, but the story of humans striving itself, the dream that power can create perfection, and the sorrow of realizing it never can. The Medici Chapel, deep within the Basilica of San Lorenzo, is not just a resting place. It is a statement carved in stone, a cathedral of pride and mortality. When visitors step inside, they are enveloped in an atmosphere of almost sacred contradiction. The gleam of colored marble, the cold hush of eternity, and the faint sense that these monuments were meant as both confession and defiance. Michelangelo himself designed this mausoleum not merely as a space of remembrance, but as a philosophical testament to the human struggle between time, death, and transcendence. In the heart of Florence, the Medici did not simply want to be remembered, they wanted to outwit oblivion. Every surface of the chapel tells a story. The walls shimmer with inlaid marble and semi-precious stone, an effect that seems to turn light into matter, as if the Medici themselves had captured the divine glow of heaven. But the eye is inevitably drawn to the sculptures, night and day, dawn and dusk. The marble allegories Michelangelo created to guard the tombs of Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. These are not idealized saints or triumphant warriors. They are human, weary, and strangely alive. Night reclines with her body twisted in uneasy sleep, her face shadowed as if troubled by eternal dreams. Day, by contrast, turns his head with restless tension, a figure caught between awakening and resignation. Together, they form a silent dialogue about existence itself, the endless cycle of light and darkness, power and decay, that defined the Medici destiny. Michelangelo's work here is not flattering. The Medici brothers are shown not as gods but as men contemplating the void. Their armor gleams, but their faces are somber, even uncertain. They do not gaze triumphantly toward heaven or the viewer, but downward, introspective, haunted. In their hands and poses, one feels not the confidence of rulers but the weariness of those who have seen the cost of ambition. It was said that Michelangelo despised the corruption of Florence under Medici rule, yet he accepted their commission because it allowed him to express his deepest philosophy. That even in the grandeur of princes, the human spirit remains a fragile, suffering thing. To stand in that chapel is to feel the presence of history pressing inward. Every echo seems to whisper of the bargains made, the bribes, the betrayals, the blood spilled in alleys and courts so that this marble could exist. The Medici believed that art could redeem power, that beauty could cleanse the stains of greed and sin. And perhaps, in a strange way, it did. The chapel is not a monument to corruption, but to the uneasy reconciliation between creation and destruction. The same family that bankrolled assassins and popes also gave the world Botticelli's Primavera and Brunelleschi's Dome. There is a legend told by Florentine guides that Michelangelo sculpted Night with such haunting beauty that one of his critics dared to suggest she seemed asleep rather than dead. To this, Michelangelo allegedly replied in a poem inscribed beneath her statue. Sleep is sweet, and being of stone is bliss, while shame and misery last among the living. Not to see, not to feel is my great happiness. So wake me not, speak softly, do not disturb. It is a line that captures the entire contradiction of the Medici story, the yearning for perfection, yet the exhaustion that follows power. In the flickering candlelight of that chapel, one begins to sense that this was not merely a family crypt but a mirror of Florence itself. The city had risen from commerce to culture, from counting coins to painting heavens. And just as Florence embodied both divine creativity and human corruption, so too did its rulers. The marble effigies of the Medici seem to slumber through eternity, but their stillness hums with tension. The sculpted faces of dawn and dusk are not at peace. They are caught forever between the birth of something radiant and its inevitable decline. Visitors in later centuries would stand before those statues and feel a strange emotion. Not awe, but melancholy. The chapel is magnificent, but also claustrophobic, as if the weight of history has been locked inside. Every curve and line is deliberate, yet there is no warmth. It is art as destiny, art as prison. Michelangelo had carved not the glory of a dynasty, but its epitaph. When John Gaston was buried there, the last of the Medici men, the silence of the chapel deepened. For the first time, the tomb's symbolic guardians, those personifications of time, had no master to protect. The cycle had closed. But even in their absence, the Medici remained omnipresent. Their emblems, the 6 red balls on a gold field, still adorned churches, guild halls, and city gates. Theirs was a power so immense that it had become architecture itself, impossible to erase. Art historians often speak of the Medici chapel as a paradox, a space built to celebrate immortality that instead reveals the inevitability of decay. But perhaps that is why it endures. The marble, untouched by centuries, seems to speak a language older than words. It tells of men who wanted to be gods, and of an artist who reminded them they were not. It tells of the fragility hidden beneath magnificence, of the silent fear that all greatness must one day crumble. There is another irony here. Michelangelo never finished the chapel. He fled Florence in 1534, disgusted by the tyranny of Duke Alessandro de' Medici, leaving his work incomplete. What remains are fragments of his vision, half-realized figures that seem to emerge from the stone itself, as if struggling to escape confinement. Their unfinished quality gives them an uncanny vitality, as if time, not the artist, decided when to stop. In that sense, the chapel is alive in a way no finished monument could ever be. Centuries later, when tourists file through its cool corridors, they often pause before night or dawn and notice how the marble seems to breathe. The figures shimmer between life and death, motion and stillness, as though the artist captured the moment just before eternity froze them. That is the genius of Michelangelo, and the genius the Medici inadvertently preserved. For even in their downfall, the Medici achieved what few rulers ever could. They turned mortality into meaning. The chapel stands not as a warning or a triumph, but as a meditation on legacy, on what remains when power fades. Every empire leaves behind ruins. The Medici left behind beauty. As the visitor leaves the chapel and steps once more into the sunlight of Florence, the city itself feels different. The bells toll in the distance, echoing through the narrow streets where stone and memory intertwine. And in that moment, one understands what the Medici truly built. Not just a dynasty, not even a Renaissance, but a vision of eternity in marble, fragile, unfinished, and yet impossibly alive. In the centuries that followed the death of John Gaston and the signing of Anna Maria Luisa's family pact, Florence underwent a transformation that would have astonished even the Medici themselves. The torches that once lit the corridors of the Palazzo Pitti dimmed, the voices of courtiers faded into whispers, and yet, the name Medici never disappeared. It lingered like incense in the air, saturating the stones of the city, haunting its streets, its museums, and its memory. Florence became, in a sense, a ghost of its own glory, not dying, but living in perpetual remembrance. And the Medici, though long gone from power, became immortal not through bloodline or empire, but through something subtler and far more enduring, myth. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, travelers began to rediscover Florence with almost religious awe. Artists, writers, and philosophers, the dreamers of the Romantic Age, wandered through its ruins and galleries as if on pilgrimage. They walked beneath Brunelleschi's dome, gazed upon Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and stood before Michelangelo's David, not realizing they were tracing the invisible footsteps of the Medici vision. To them, Florence was no longer a city of politics or banking. It was an eternal sanctuary of beauty. And though the Medici had once ruled through cunning and calculation, history had recast them as divine patrons, flawed yet fated instruments of art's survival. It is one of history's strangest miracles that a family so entangled in corruption and bloodshed became symbols of enlightenment and progress. Their sins were many: manipulation of the papacy, the orchestration of assassinations, the silencing of rivals. Yet their contributions to human civilization were undeniable. Without their gold, there might have been no Leonardo or Galileo. Without their ambition, no Florence as we know it today. The paradox of their legacy became the very essence of the city. Radiant on the surface, shadowed beneath. The Medici myth grew stronger as the world changed. During the 19th century, when Italy fought for unification, Florence briefly became the capital of the new nation. Politicians and poets alike invoked the name of the Medici as symbols of a golden Italian spirit that could once again lead Europe. Streets were renamed, statues erected, and scholars began to sift through archives to uncover every trace of the dynasty. Yet even as historians separated fact from legend, the legend itself proved more powerful. To speak of the Medici was to speak of destiny, of the dream that beauty could outlast empire. In the 20th century, as wars scarred Europe and totalitarian regimes rose and fell, Florence once again found itself under threat. During World War II, Nazi troops occupied the city, looting treasures and destroying bridges in retreat. Yet by a twist of fate, most of the city's art, the legacy of the Medici, survived. It was said that even the German commanders, standing in the Uffizi's shadow, hesitated to destroy what had once been blessed by their name. The bridges fell, but the paintings endured. It was as if the ghosts of Lorenzo and Cosimo still stood guard, unwilling to let their vision be erased. In the decades after the war, restoration became a national mission. Cracked frescoes were cleaned, sculptures repaired, palaces reopened. The Medici coat of arms, the 6 red balls, was no longer a mark of political domination but a cultural sigil, an emblem of Florence's soul. Tourists came in waves, drawn not by the stories of conquest or corruption, but by the art, by the promise of beauty born from darkness. And so, ironically, the Medici achieved their greatest triumph after death. They became immortal not as rulers, but as curators of the human spirit. But beneath the surface, the darker threads of their story remained. In archives and family letters, historians found evidence of the Medici's secret dealings. Coded correspondence with spies, ledgers of forbidden loans, even hidden reports of poisonings covered up by clerics. For every cathedral they built, there was a rival destroyed. For every artist they sponsored, there was a dissenter silenced. Florence, for all its splendor, was a city forged as much by fear as by faith. And yet, perhaps that is what gives its beauty its strange intensity. Perfection born from imperfection. Light defined by shadow. Modern scholars often debate whether the Medici were visionaries or villains, whether they uplifted humanity or merely exploited it. But such distinctions seem almost meaningless when one walks through the Uffizi, where every wall vibrates with the pulse of what they set in motion. The truth is, the Medici were both. They were the embodiment of the Renaissance itself. A contradiction, a balance between divine aspiration and human frailty. Their world was one where science and superstition, art and greed, faith and lust all shared the same table. Even now, centuries later, traces of their presence can still be felt in subtle ways. The rhythm of Florentine life, its festivals, its architecture, even its politics, bears their imprint. The palio races in Siena, though outside their city, still echo the rivalries they once fueled. The academic traditions of Europe, with their emphasis on patronage and progress, descend in part from their methods. Their fingerprints are everywhere, in the colors of frescoes, the curvature of domes, the very language of modern finance. There is a haunting irony in how history remembers them. In life they were feared, in death adored. Their cruelty has been softened by time, their excesses recast as eccentricities. We no longer see the blood on their hands, only the beauty their gold preserved. Yet perhaps that is their final manipulation, the ultimate act of power. They understood, better than any of their contemporaries, that legacy is not written in ink or decrees, but in emotion. If they could make the world feel something centuries after their deaths, awe, envy, wonder, then they would never truly die. Every generation rediscovers the Medici in its own way. To the Romantics, they were divine patrons. To modern historians, political geniuses. To artists, timeless muses. And yet, beneath all the interpretations lies a single truth. The Medici were human beings trying to carve immortality out of the fragile clay of life. They succeeded, but at immense cost. When one stands on the Ponte Vecchio at twilight, watching the Arno reflect the golden light of the city, it feels as though the centuries dissolve. Somewhere in that glow, you can still sense the whisper of their ambition, the echo of Lorenzo's laughter in a candlelit hall, the faint rustle of silk robes in the corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio. Florence remains their monument, their confession, and their masterpiece. For in the end, the Medici did what all great powers dream of but few achieve. They became myth. Their wealth vanished, their line extinguished, their titles erased. And yet, their presence endures in every brushstroke, every note of music, every thought that aspires toward beauty despite the weight of mortality. They proved that power fades, but creation, once born, cannot be silenced. The Renaissance they sparked was never truly about art or science or philosophy. It was about the human longing to transcend decay, to make meaning in a world that forgets. And that, perhaps, is the darkest and most luminous secret of the Medici. They turned their own corruption into the raw material of eternity. If the story of the Medici were a play, then Florence itself would be the stage that refuses to go dark. Even now, centuries after the final curtain fell, the echoes of their dialogue still linger in the air. In the quiet alleys behind the Duomo, in the soft chime of church bells at dusk, in the steady rhythm of footsteps across cobblestones polished by time. Every stone, every fresco, every bridge seems to whisper a fragment of their tale. The Medici are not gone. They have simply dissolved into the architecture of the city they made immortal. To walk through Florence today is to walk through layers of time. The Palazzo Vecchio still towers over the Piazza della Signoria, its fortress-like silhouette a reminder of when the Medici seized power through both cunning and blood. Inside, frescoes still depict scenes of triumph, battles, processions, allegories of virtue. Yet if you look closely, the paint itself feels almost fragile, as though the ghosts of those who once stood beneath them are pressing outward, trying to speak again. Down the hall, in the Vasari corridor that snakes above the streets, the Medici once moved unseen between palace and gallery, their passage guarded from the eyes of the common people. It remains there still, an invisible artery through which the pulse of their ambition once beat. The Uffizi, too, bears their mark. It was never meant to be a museum. It was a place of administration, built by Cosimo I to centralize his bureaucratic machine. Yet over time, it became a treasury of the very soul the Medici had cultivated. A sanctuary of paintings and sculptures that told their story more honestly than any chronicle. In the dim halls, under the gaze of Botticelli's Venus and Leonardo's angelic figures, one feels the strange duality of their legacy. The merging of politics and poetry, of ruthless power and transcendent vision. The Medici collected art not just for beauty's sake, but as a form of propaganda, proof that they were chosen, anointed by genius itself. And yet, by that same act, they made Florence a capital of the human spirit. Even the streets carry their secrets. The Via Tornabuoni, now lined with boutiques, was once the heart of their influence, the address of their bankers, allies, and rivals. The Medici coat of arms still hangs above doorways, not as a symbol of fear, but of heritage. Locals pass beneath it daily, often without noticing, unaware that they are walking in the shadows of the world's first modern dynasty. But for those who pause, who listen closely, the air hums with stories. Some say that on quiet nights, if you stand near the Ponte Santa Trinita and look toward the Pitti Palace, you can almost see a flicker of torchlight moving through its corridors, as though Lorenzo the Magnificent himself is walking home, deep in conversation with a poet, planning another feast, another alliance, another vision for Florence. Perhaps it is only imagination, or perhaps it is memory, the kind that cities themselves possess. Because Florence is not a city that forgets. It remembers every secret, every betrayal, every act of grace. It remembers the Pazzi Conspiracy, when blood spilled across the floor of the cathedral. It remembers Savonarola's bonfires, when paintings burned and faith was tested. It remembers the laughter of artists in workshops funded by Medici gold. And it remembers, too, the silence after their passing. A silence filled not with loss, but with awe. Tourists flood the city today, phones in hand, snapping pictures of domes and statues. They marvel at the beauty but rarely see the price behind it. Beneath their feet lie bones and foundations built from centuries of labor, exploitation, and vision intertwined. Every masterpiece in Florence carries a shadow, every stroke of genius balanced by an act of control. The Medici understood that beauty could sanctify power, that art could disguise empire. And in doing so, they taught the world how politics could be transformed into performance, how history itself could be sculpted. There are corners of the city where the Medici's presence feels most intimate. The small chapel in San Lorenzo where Cosimo the Elder lies buried in unmarked modesty. The study of Francesco I in the Palazzo Vecchio, decorated with alchemical symbols and hidden doors, where science and mysticism once danced together. The hidden corridors where whispers of conspiracy once traveled faster than the sound of bells. These spaces are not grand, but they pulse with the electricity of the Renaissance mind, the belief that human intellect could reach the divine. In the modern age, historians often debate whether Florence's devotion to its past has hindered its future. They say the city is a museum, trapped in the amber of nostalgia. But that is precisely what the Medici intended. They wanted Florence to be eternal, not in the sense of political power but as an idea. To them, immortality was not ruling forever, but being remembered forever. The Renaissance was their scripture, and Florence their cathedral. Yet beneath this sanctified image, a question remains, one that echoes through the corridors of the Uffizi and the silent chapels of San Lorenzo. Was it worth it? Was the glory of the Renaissance worth the blood that fed it? Could a family that mastered art and architecture ever truly atone for the manipulation and greed that made such splendor possible? Perhaps that is why the Medici story endures, because it forces us to confront the uneasy truth that all creation demands a price. The Medici paid it in ambition, and Florence in faith. But together, they achieved something greater than either could alone. They turned the chaos of human desire into harmony, the brutality of power into beauty. As the sun sets over the Arno, painting the river gold, one can almost believe that Florence breathes in rhythm with their memory. The same light that once shone through the workshop windows of Leonardo still falls on the city's walls. The same air that carried the scent of oil paint and ink still drifts through its squares. Time has changed everything, and yet, somehow, nothing. The Medici have become legend not because they escaped death, but because they embraced it. Their palaces decay, their portraits crack, their marble fades, but the idea of them persists, transforming with each generation. To the Florentines, they are both ancestors and ghosts. To the world, they are symbols of the dangerous beauty of ambition. And so, Florence remains what it always was under their rule: a mirror. It reflects both the best and worst of humanity, the capacity to create wonders and commit sins in the same breath. The Medici taught the world that greatness is never pure, that light is born only through shadow. And as long as Florence stands, that lesson will continue to shimmer beneath its sunlit facades, waiting for those who care to look closely enough to see. There is something almost uncanny about the way the Medici name refuses to fade. Centuries have passed, dynasties have come and gone, yet the Medici remain as alive in our collective imagination as they were in the candlelit corridors of Renaissance Florence. Their portraits stare down from museum walls, serene, regal, inscrutable, and their symbols, the 6 red balls of their coat of arms, still adorn the stones of the city like echoes carved into time itself. They have become more than historical figures. They are archetypes. Each generation reshapes them to reflect its own fears and desires. The corrupt bankers, the enlightened patrons, the manipulators of faith, the fathers of modern art. Their shadows stretch far beyond Tuscany, touching everything from modern finance to the very idea of what civilization means. In truth, the Medici story never ended. It merely transformed. After Anna Maria Luisa's death, her pact preserved the art of Florence as a sacred trust, and the myth of her family grew larger than life. Historians began to write about them not as rulers but as symbols, embodiments of the Renaissance spirit itself. The Medici became a kind of moral paradox in motion. A family that gained power through deceit and control but used that power to fund beauty and knowledge. Their tale resonated because it captured something timeless about human nature: the tension between creation and corruption, between the will to dominate and the longing to uplift. In modern times, the Medici have reemerged not through bloodlines, but through culture. Films, novels, television series, even video games, all have revived their legend, each adding its own layer of interpretation. Sometimes they are portrayed as ruthless tyrants, sometimes as visionaries who saved Europe from the darkness of ignorance. Both are true. They were merchants who dreamed of eternity, sinners who believed in beauty, mortals who behaved like gods. That contradiction is why we cannot look away from them. The Medici story is not simply history. It is mythology woven from fact. The deeper one studies their legacy, the more one realizes that the Medici did something profoundly modern. They understood image not as vanity but as power. Long before propaganda became a tool of states, the Medici mastered it through art. Every portrait commissioned, every church facade they funded, every fresco that bore their likeness was part of a calculated act of storytelling. They turned Florence itself into a living advertisement for their greatness. Their wealth bought not just land or armies, but belief. In doing so, they taught future generations, kings, presidents, corporations, how to shape perception, how to control history through beauty. And that is the irony that still lingers like perfume in the halls of the Uffizi. The Medici understood better than anyone that power dies, but stories do not. They ensured that their narrative, however complicated, would outlive their flesh. In the end, their true masterpiece was not a painting, a sculpture, or a palace. It was the myth of themselves. But myths are dangerous things. They can obscure as much as they illuminate. For every image of Lorenzo the Magnificent as a golden prince of peace, there exists another, of a cunning politician who suppressed rivals with subtle terror. For every tale of Cosimo's wisdom, there is the shadow of the banker manipulating the papacy for profit. The Medici blurred the lines between virtue and vice so completely that it became impossible to separate the two. Perhaps that, too, was intentional. They knew that morality shifts with perspective, but art endures without argument. In recent years, scholars have begun to peel back the layers of their legend, uncovering new truths buried in archives and letters. They reveal a family far more complex than the sanitized portraits suggest. Men and women driven by insecurity, ambition, and fear. Lorenzo, for instance, privately doubted his worthiness to lead, confessing in his writings that he was tired of the burdens of greatness. Cosimo I, who built the Uffizi, struggled with paranoia, convinced that assassins lurked behind every wall. And Catherine de' Medici, remembered as the Black Queen of France, wielded poison and diplomacy with equal precision, not out of malice, but survival. The Medici legacy, in its truest form, is not one of perfect mastery, but of relentless endurance. They were not gods among men. They were human beings who refused to be forgotten. That refusal has shaped the very DNA of Florence. Every restoration, every preservation effort, every guided tour that tells their story is another act of resurrection. The Medici are the city's eternal heartbeat, pulsing beneath centuries of dust. Even the modern Florentine economy thrives on their afterimage, the art tourism, the academic pilgrimages, the constant search for meaning in their myth. In a strange way, they are still funding Florence, centuries after their vaults were emptied. There is something hauntingly poetic about that. The Medici, who once manipulated faith and fortune to secure immortality, have indeed achieved it, though not in the way they imagined. Their bloodline has vanished, their political power dissolved, but their vision, the belief that beauty can grant eternity, remains as vivid as ever. Every artist who dreams of transcending time, every scientist who defies convention, every thinker who challenges power owes a subtle debt to the world the Medici built. And yet, for all their triumphs, their story is also a warning. The Medici show us what happens when ambition outpaces morality, when power is cloaked in refinement. They remind us that civilization's brightest lights are often fueled by shadows we choose not to see. The art they left behind dazzles us, but if one listens closely, beneath the brushstrokes and marble, there is an echo, the sound of bargains made, of promises broken, of souls weighed against legacy. To stand in Florence at night, when the tourists have gone and the streets are quiet, is to feel their presence most keenly. The lamplight glows against the old stones, and the city breathes as though alive, whispering of its past. Somewhere, beyond the walls of the Palazzo Pitti or in the cool silence of San Lorenzo, it is easy to imagine that the Medici are still there, not as ghosts but as ideas, watching, remembering, waiting for the world to understand the lesson they left behind. That power, however vast, is fleeting, but the beauty born from it can outlast death itself. The Medici may have been the architects of Florence's grandeur, but they were also the architects of their own myth. And in that myth lies the paradox of humanity itself, our hunger for control, our longing for transcendence, and our eternal hope that something of us might survive the collapse of time. Centuries later, the Medici remain more than a chapter in history. They are a mirror reflecting our own ambitions and contradictions. Their palaces stand as silent witnesses to humanity's endless struggle between virtue and greed, faith and manipulation, creation and control. Every fresco they commissioned, every alliance they forged, speaks to a single timeless truth, that greatness is never pure. In their rise and fall, we see the blueprint of modern power, how art can justify domination, how beauty can disguise corruption. And yet, without their vision, the Renaissance itself might have never blossomed. Florence was their canvas, but the world became their gallery. Their story lingers not because of what they built, but because of what they revealed about us all. That beneath every golden age lies a shadow, and within every shadow, the spark of something eternal. Centuries have passed since the last Medici breathed their final breath, yet their spirit lingers like the scent of old incense in a cathedral. Florence itself feels haunted, not by ghosts of vengeance, but by the beauty they refused to let die. Their story is carved into the marble of palaces, whispered in the galleries, reflected in the Arno's slow-moving waters. Tourists may come for the art, but what they truly encounter is the echo of ambition, the eternal bargain between light and shadow that the Medici perfected. They remind us that greatness always comes at a cost, and that even corruption can birth creation. The family that once ruled through power now rules through memory, proving that art, when born from desire and danger, can outlast even the most formidable empires. Florence stands as their monument, a city that is both their triumph and their confession, still breathing the name Medici with every sunrise. As the final light fades over Florence, the Medici remain, not as ghosts, but as whispers carried through the centuries. Their story is a reminder that every civilization balances on the edge between creation and corruption, between vision and vanity. They built beauty from ambition, faith from control, and immortality from the fleeting pulse of human desire. The art they left behind still glows with the same fire that once burned in their hearts, a silent defiance against time itself. To walk through Florence is to walk through their dream, a dream both glorious and dangerous. Perhaps that is why their legend endures, because it reflects us all. We too hunger for legacy, for meaning, for something that will outlive our names. The Medici achieved it not through purity, but through passion. And in that truth lies their greatest lesson. That power fades, empires fall, but what we create in the pursuit of beauty, that, and only that, can make us eternal. Florence sleeps, but the Medici never truly rest. Their shadows linger in the glow of lamplight on ancient stone, in the soft murmur of tourists tracing their steps. Theirs is not a tale of kings or saints, but of dreamers who shaped eternity with ambition and art. Every masterpiece, every echo of a church bell, whispers their name. Time has devoured their flesh but not their vision. The city remains their living monument, proof that even the darkest power can leave behind immortal light. In Florence, the Medici are not gone. They have simply become the air itself,